He said, ma'am, I got to tell you, your son is gone. I said, gone? He said, he got killed. And I fell to my knees.
There are shots being fired.
There is a dead male on the scene.
She knew, I have to flee. I have to get away.
In this first episode of a two-part special, we reveal a tragic tale of greed.
There was an uptick in robberies involving wigs and other hair products.
And bitter revenge.
It was the worst night and the worst phone call that I have ever received.
And a payback story where nothing is as it first seems.
Now the police cannot trust anything that she says.
It was hard to believe that someone that young was going to be involved in something like this.
At 3:25 p.m. on January 22, 2016, police in Memphis, Tennessee, received multiple 911 calls about shots fired at an apartment complex near a school in the eastern suburb of Cordova.
The crime rate was lower in that area than some others. And to hear those shots ring out, startled neighbors, startled children.
Children are being released out of school. To have those kids being released, getting off the bus, and this type of event is taking place, had to have been really scary.
Memphis police respond quickly.
They see this young man laying in the parking lot in his own blood with multiple gunshot wounds.
Officers secure the area, finding no sign of an active shooter.
They see that they're not in danger. They see that they can't save him. He's pronounced dead at the scene.
A wallet in the man's pocket contains a driver's license.
They are able to ID the body of the male deceased victim as Eddie Tate Jr.
There is no shortage of stunned onlookers in the parking lot.
This is in the middle of the day. It's in an apartment complex. So once these shots were fired, there was a lot of activity. We had multiple witnesses.
They report seeing a dark green Honda in the lot. After the gunshots, a black woman got out of the Honda and did something unexpected.
This woman exited the vehicle, came around to the driver's side, removed Eddie Tate's body.
A female drags the male victim out of the vehicle, gets in the vehicle and drives off. So on the surface, we're thinking, carjacking.
Is Eddie's death a tragic case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or is there more to this chaotic scene than meets the eye?
We quickly realized that it was not what we thought it was in the beginning.
Edward James Tate Jr. was born on August 27, 1985, to parents Eddie Tate Sr. and Gloria Adams.
And he was born in Shelby County, Memphis, Tennessee, at St. Francis Hospital, 6 pounds and 11 ounces. Bouncing, handsome boy. To me, my pride and joy, my only child.
Growing up in the small town of Oakland, just east of Memphis, Eddie, known to his friends and family as EJ, was independent and curious.
EJ, he was different. He's very quiet. He's well-mannered. He read a lot of books, and he was intelligent. He stayed to himself. He's a loner.
In 2000, Eddie entered Fayette Ware High School in Somerville, where he emerged from his quiet shell and eventually became vice president of his freshman class.
He went there for 4 years, and when he after graduating, he went to ITT, technical school. He majored in engineering. And for some reason or another, he didn't want to actually continue doing engineering. He wanted to be more out there on his own.
Around 2005, Eddie went into business with his cousin Mario.
Mario wanted to do hair. He said hair was on the market. He was really going to sell and make money. So he told EJ he wanted him to come into the business with him. So EJ said, oh, okay.
The culture in Memphis with hair or weaves, it's huge, especially within the Black community. Our hair is very important to us because just from the beginning of time, it was the one thing I believe we could kind of own. So coming to, America, being, enslaved, oftentimes we didn't have control of our bodies. The hair was the one thing we could kind of, it could give us our own personality and our own sense of self.
And so if you come to Memphis, Tennessee, you can see that everybody's hair is done to a T. And if it's not done, they're headed there. And this is not just for women. This is for men as well. They spend hours in the barbershop. They spend hours at salons. And so this is a cultural thing.
Eddie and Mario focused on importing and selling natural human hair of the highest quality. It was more expensive, but they wanted to offer the best.
It's hair that's untreated, unbleached, untampered with in any way. It's pure hair.
Just to go to a storefront to buy your hair, it's not always the best choice. So EJ offered that. EJ offered this luxury hair. And the best part about it, he would deliver it to you.
A lot of people, especially in certain communities, expect that you're going to be able to, if you're paying $200, $300, $400, $500, $1,000, that you might, be able to get this hand delivered to you as well.
In his personal life, Eddie was also building a future with his new wife.
EJ had gotten married, and during that time, they had moved to Mason, Tennessee, over in Covington. They was inseparable. They did everything together. Their love was unique. They was great together.
In 2009, the couple welcomed a daughter. Eddie was a devoted father, but he struggled to remain a committed husband.
He had wandering eyes. EJ went to wandering a little bit. His attention went to branching out. Finally, they decided they would go their own separate ways.
Although Eddie moved back to his childhood home in Somerville, he and his ex worked together to co-parent their daughter.
There's no arguing, no feuding, no disagreement. They will all be courteous to each other.
And in his professional life, Eddie and his cousin Mario continued to expand their business, dubbed Virgin Hair for Us.
And they both would go out in different separate areas in Fayette County and do the hair. Well, as they continued to do hair, their name became very popular. Then they decided, well, we're going to branch out more than Fayette County. We're just doing great with hair. So then it came into Shelby County.
Business was booming, but Eddie was lonely.
Maybe 2 years later, he met Edwina. We called her Wee Wee.
Edwina Marquette Thomas worked at a local hospital and was a single mother to 2 daughters. She made a strong first impression.
I think EJ fell in love with her because of her smile. Edwina has the prettiest smile that you have ever seen. She was just a good person, all around.
He said, "Mom, I met a girl." He said, "She quiet. She has 2 children." I said, "Oh, okay." And he said, he said, "She got a sweet family. She got a sweet family."
Soon after they started dating, Eddie brought Edwina and her daughters to meet his mother.
They all came to attend my birthday. And it was always a joyful event. They was close. You could tell.
A few months later, the couple decided to move in together.
She had a genuine love. She did. You could see it on her face. She loved EJ. EJ was with her, and he seemed to be, he was happy.
On January 22, 2016, the couple's future is shattered by bullets. Eddie Tate Jr. lies dead in the parking lot of an apartment building in a Memphis suburb. Witnesses have described a car and a woman they think were part of the incident.
There was a green Honda Civic, a female passenger in the vehicle who later removed Eddie's body from the vehicle, jumped into the driver's seat, and fled the scene.
Then, investigators learned that there was another suspicious vehicle that might have been involved.
One of the witnesses that I spoke to had said that they saw two cars driving away real fast right after the shots. One of them was green, the other was a gray or silver car.
A witness was able to identify both the green Honda Civic that was there on the scene minutes before the shooting took place. Also exiting the scene, the witness was also able to identify a silver Mitsubishi.
They both, once the shooting was over, fled at a high rate of speed. We assumed that one of them would have been a suspect car, one of them would have been a victim car, but of course, at that time, we didn't know for certain.
Memphis detectives continue to work the scene of a shooting that left 30-year-old Eddie Tate Jr. dead. Multiple witnesses recall a green Honda and a silver Mitsubishi fleeing the scene in the moments after the shots rang out.
As it turns out, our witnesses hear the gunshots. There's anywhere from several seconds to a minute delay. Then they look out and see what they see. So we did not actually have an eyewitness to the shooting. We had multiple witnesses that saw right after what transpired.
Some saw a young black woman in the green car. Another saw the driver of the silver car, who was also a young black woman.
They look out and then they see her running toward a silver Mitsubishi. She falls, and then she gets in the vehicle by herself and drives off at a high rate of speed.
The same witness has another important piece of information: the tag number for the silver car.
They gave that to the officers. The officers put out a broadcast to be on the lookout for it.
The witness accounts are consistent when it comes to the woman in the green Honda and the woman in the silver Mitsubishi. But from there, the details vary, including a possible third woman.
Several of the witnesses saw someone in multicolored leggings go inside the victim's green Honda.
They may or may not be looking for a third person, the person who is rummaging through the vehicle.
Witnesses, they see different things at different times. I may see you in a green shirt. Someone else may see you in a dark colored shirt. So, and that's kind of the situation that we ran into. Several clothing descriptions, several activities that people were doing, and we had to, kind of weed through that.
While detectives continue taking statements, forensic techs scour the crime scene for evidence.
Homicide detectives look at the body. They see that Eddie Tate Jr. was shot 4 times.
They found several projectiles and casings from a 9mm. Without the gun, you couldn't tell for sure. It is very likely that they all came from the same 9mm handgun.
Eddie Tate's wallet was accounted for. There was still money present in Eddie Tate's wallet.
Then, detectives get word that the chaos isn't over. It's still unfolding just around the corner.
Someone had come and flagged down some officers and said, hey, that they had a female that pulled up in front of their apartment that was beating on their door. When they opened the door, she said, "I'm shot and he's dead."
EMS, the ambulance, and other first responders rushed to the scene because the victim in this instance is still alive.
She wasn't talking. She was on her way to unresponsive.
By the time detectives arrive, the woman is already being rushed to the hospital. But outside the apartment, investigators spot the dark green Honda with a broken window and 2 bullet holes.
We have, this female that shot, and then their car's parked outside, and I looked in it, and it's all covered in blood. I talked to the people in the apartment, and basically that's, their story was that they were at home, and then all of a sudden they hear a knock on the door, someone screaming for help. They open the door, and she says that she's been shot.
She was losing breath, like she was like running out of breath, so they had her sit down. And she said, as she sat down, the lady had a yellow couch, if I'm not mistaken, and she said the couch just started turning red. And she said at that moment, that's when they realized, like, okay, we need to get her help.
Investigators theorized the woman was also a victim in the attack, sitting in the passenger seat of the Honda when gunfire erupted.
Her survival instincts kicked in, and she knew, I have to flee. I have to get away. She immediately went into action. She pulled Eddie out of the car. She got over in that driver's seat, and she fled. She drove herself to safety, trying her best to save herself.
I can't imagine how she was feeling at the time, knowing like I'm fighting for my life.
Detectives learned the woman is undergoing emergency surgery at a local hospital. She has been identified as 33-year-old Edwina Wee Wee Thomas, the girlfriend of the other shooting victim, Eddie Tate.
They were doing everything they could to keep her alive.
Edwina Thomas, known to loved ones as Wee Wee, is undergoing surgery at a hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. The single mother sustained multiple life-threatening gunshot wounds during the attack that killed her boyfriend, Eddie Tate Jr.
We know that there is a dead male on the scene and a victim that has been shot, transported to the hospital. So then, of course, we sent an investigator to the hospital, but she was already in surgery.
While they await word from doctors, detectives need to have a difficult conversation with Eddie's loved ones.
I was asked to make the notification to Eddie Tate's family. Once I get there, I explain to them who I am, what I'm here for.
He's Miss Tate, you might want to sit down. And he came in and I said, where is he in the med? That's when you get hurt so bad. I said, he in the med. And he said, no. And I said, why are you here? And he said, ma'am, I got to tell you, your son is gone. I said, gone? He said, he got killed. The policeman said he got killed. And I fell to my knees. And I just screamed. I couldn't scream. And I said, Lord God, you took my baby. You took all I had in life. And I just started crying and screaming. And I said, who killed him? Who killed my child? And he said, whoever killed him, they got away.
And it's not just Eddie who was shot.
And he said, well, we got shot numerous places too, in her stomach and other places on her body. So, but she's in a bad shape too.
The news is even more brutal given what Eddie shared with Gloria just 2 days before.
He had called me that Wednesday night. He said, you might be getting another little grandbaby. And I said, oh, well, I'm slow. I said, another grandbaby? I said, where? Mom, what you mean, where? I said, oh, wee. Like that, I said, oh, we be pregnant. He said, yeah, we be pregnant.
Eddie's mother goes on to tell investigators that her son and his cousin Mario ran a cash business selling expensive hair bundles. That meant meeting up with people they sometimes didn't know, all while carrying large amounts of cash.
Virgin hair starts at about $120, and that's really just for a straight, let's just say 10 to 12 inch. The more you go up in inches, the more costly it is. If you're looking for anything over 22 inches, it's very possible for you to spend in the thousands for those.
As a precaution, she says, Eddie never went on deliveries alone.
Where he was at to go deliver the hair, he always would have a rider. I would ride with him, or his girlfriend would ride with him, but he always had just one person that would ride with him to deliver all the hair.
Eddie's mother tells investigators that Eddie and Edwina were making deliveries on the day of the shooting.
He had called me at 2 o'clock that day. He said, "Oh, I was just calling to holler at you." I said, "Okay." I said, "What you finna do?" He said, "Well, I got this old chicken head. I'm finna go sell some hair to it."
He did not name the buyer, but said she was a repeat customer.
He said, "I sold some hair to her this morning at 8 o'clock. And he said, I'm gonna go take the hair, take her some hair, take hair back to her." She said it wasn't the right length and she didn't like it. And she called me back and said that she wanted her money back. And he said, "You know, we don't give money back." I let her know I'll give her a different grade of hair. I'll let her look at some more hair, but we don't refund the money.
Eddie had his wallet on him when he was found, but it did not contain the amount of money expected after a big sale. Also, investigators did not find any bundles of hair in Eddie's green Honda. As investigators wrap up with Gloria, they know there is still one person who might be able to tell them what happened: Edwina.
The police would say, "We rushed her to the hospital." I said, "Well," he said, "Well, maybe she'll gain conscience where she can talk and tell who had actually did the shooting."
Investigators in Memphis are looking into the brutal midday shooting of Eddie Tate Jr. and Edwina Thomas. Witnesses had seen Edwina drive off in Eddie's green Honda, as well as another woman driving another car.
There was a silver Mitsubishi that was also unseen, and a witness was able to at least provide the details, including the license plate of that vehicle.
Some witnesses also reported a possible third woman wearing multicolored leggings rummaging through Eddie's car after the shots rang out. When detectives check on Edwina, doctors advise that her injuries are critical. She has 2 gunshot wounds, one to her kidney and intestine, and the other to her left forearm. But there's more: the poignant and harrowing detail that Edwina is 8 weeks pregnant. It's unclear whether Edwina and her unborn child will survive. Edwina Marquette Thomas was born on June 13, 1982, in Fayette County, Tennessee. She grew up with 2 sisters, 4 brothers, and a host of cousins.
Our family is pretty huge. We would all just meet at my grandmother's house on Sunday.
The older people, they would cook, and the younger crowd, like, we're outside having water balloon fights, and it was a great feeling, like, just to have your family around.
Wee Wee was my first cousin, but we kind of grew up as sisters. Just a great person, an amazing friend, my very first best friend.
As a big sister, she was like a second mom. She treated me like her kid.
She liked to pull the big sister card to let me know, hey, I'm the boss, mom's gone, and you have to listen to me. So sometimes we bumped heads, but for the most part, it was fun. I hung out with her a lot. She kind of taught me a lot.
As a teenager, Edwina attended Fayette Ware High School in Somerville, where she commanded attention.
We loved clothes. Like, she loved to look nice, she loved to dress nice, and she loved boys. She was popular with the guys, so guess that's a good thing.
In 1999, Edwina fell in love.
That was her man, that was her boyfriend, that was her first real solid love.
Edwina became pregnant, but soon after the birth of her daughter, the relationship ended.
It's just like any other breakup. In the beginning, it's not good. But as we got older, and you understand that parenting is the most important thing, they reconnected, and so they ended up on good terms, which is a good thing.
Edwina took the responsibilities of being a single mom head on.
She did go on to Concord Medical, so she got a degree from there, and she started working at the hospital.
Over the next few years, Edwina gave birth to another daughter and faced more heartbreak in her personal life.
She really didn't date much until she met Crystal's dad, which was her second daughter. So then after those two, she met a new boyfriend. They had moved in together, plans on marriage, but he got into a motorcycle accident and he passed away.
The loss was devastating. Edwina was unsure if she would love again.
She just, was still dealing with that grief before she opened back up to someone else.
Eventually, that someone was Eddie Tate Jr.
When she started to date him, we saw a totally different side of her. It's like a more open, more loving, she just was happier. She was a happier person when she met him. You could just tell, like, he really cared, and he was her protector.
But now, Eddie has died from 4 gunshot wounds, and Memphis doctors fight to save Edwina's life. However, her injuries are too severe.
Edwina was later pronounced at the hospital.
It means her baby passed away too. For the second time in a matter of hours, detectives must deliver devastating news to another family.
My mom called and I merged her in with me and my sister, and she was crying.
I just remember her saying, "She's gone, somebody killed her." And at that moment, I remember dropping the phone and I fell to the floor. I fell to the floor crying. I could hear my mom crying. I could hear my brother crying.
That night was one of the, I'm not going to say one of the worst nights. It was the worst night and the worst phone call that I have ever received in 34 years of living.
For detectives working the case, news of Edwina's and her unborn child's deaths means that the stakes are even higher.
She was about 6 to 8 weeks pregnant, meaning that law enforcement, they're no longer dealing with a homicide or a double homicide. Now they're dealing with a triple homicide.
News of the daytime shooting deaths of Eddie Tate Jr., Edwina Thomas, and their unborn child tears through Memphis, leaving the community outraged and on edge.
This was a young couple and a child that had not been born yet, so it poured on the heartstrings of many. And with it, the community, law enforcement, families, the families of the victims, they wanted justice.
Detectives have one lead. A silver Mitsubishi witnesses saw speeding from the scene. A bolo on the vehicle's tag number produces nothing. Then, an officer notices a critical mistake.
The tag number on the vehicle, either between the witness calling in or the dispatcher, the last number was either transposed or it was incorrect.
So initially, we were looking for the wrong car.
And one of the officers changed the number up on the last digit, and it came back to a silver Mitsubishi. Had an address about 3 miles away from the shooting scene.
And records eventually reveal a very surprising person of interest.
Detectives determined that the driver of that silver Mitsubishi is 18-year-old high school student Victoria C.
Investigators run Victoria's name through a database of criminal records.
Victoria, she has a clean record. She's never been in trouble with the law.
The first thing that I really recognized was that she was really young. You know, it was hard to believe that someone that young was going to be involved in something like this.
Could this young woman really be a cold-blooded killer?
Detectives locate Victoria's residence, and it is her mother who answers the door.
She's informed us that yes, her daughter's driving a car. And what did the police need with her daughter? So at that point, we asked her to have her daughter come home.
She called Victoria Say on the phone and said that the police officers were there and wanted to talk with her. Victoria showed up probably 10 to 15 minutes later.
She was acting very normal. She wasn't, she wasn't asking us why we were there. She wasn't asking us what was going on. She wasn't arguing, she wasn't combative or anything. And so she got into the squad car and they brought her down to the office.
Police also take possession of the silver Mitsubishi.
We verified that the tag information given us by the witnesses what was on the vehicle. So we just immediately towed it to the impound lot so that, once the initial investigation slowed down, we'd get a warrant for the vehicle. So we go into the interview room and introduce ourselves. Victoria's very calm.
She's asked, obviously, the question about the shooting. Are you responsible for this? She says no. She never denied being on the scene, but she said she was not responsible for shooting the victims.
The questioning lasts several hours.
The detectives, they dig in real hard with Victoria. They let her know. We have witnesses that place you at the scene. So Victoria bends a little bit.
Victoria explains that she was spending the day with her friend and high school classmate, Shelby Isaac.
Shelby and Victoria were very good friends and had been for a while. They did know each other during high school. Victoria would do Shelby's hair. Shelby would buy hair for herself and then have Victoria put it in for her.
Victoria said they had met up earlier in the day with Eddie, the victim, to purchase some hair weave.
The trio met in the parking lot of a local fast food restaurant to make the transaction.
She and Shelby Isaac had went over there to meet the hairman and bought $250 hair from him.
Victoria explains that Shelby didn't really inspect the hair until later.
We learned that Shelby had decided that she didn't like the quality of the hair that she had purchased from Eddie.
And there was some discussion after that Shelby wanted to get her money back. There was a phone call made to Eddie Tate, wanted to meet him in the Sycamore Lakes apartments where Shelby Isaac lives, and they proceeded to go to that location.
Victoria says she drove Shelby to the apartment complex where Shelby lived to meet up with Eddie for the second time.
As they get ready to park, Shelby sees Eddie's green car And obviously it's the car that they had met earlier. So Shelby gets out of the car.
Their initial suspect is about to explain her version of what happened on that terrible day. After Eddie Tate Jr., his girlfriend Edwina Thomas, and their unborn baby were killed in a shooting, Memphis police questioned 18-year-old Victoria C. about the crime. Victoria says that she and her friend, 18-year-old Shelby Isaac, met up with Eddie to negotiate a refund for a hair bundle.
She was unhappy with her purchase, so she went to get her money back.
Victoria claims she drove Shelby to the apartment complex, and then Shelby got out, leaving her to park.
As Victoria's parking the car, Shelby's already out walking over to Eddie's car.
According to Victoria, she hears gunshots. She sees Shelby with the gun in her hand. She screams, "Oh my God," and then Victoria runs back to her vehicle. She falls right before she gets in, and then she drives off at high rate of speed.
She leaves Shelby. She drives across the street to another apartment complex and starts calling Shelby. "Hey, are you okay? Where are you?" Shelby says, "I'm right up here at the front. Come and get me." So Victoria pulls up to the front of the complex, picks Shelby up, they drive off.
Victoria places the blame directly on her friend Shelby, even claiming Shelby confessed to her.
Victoria then says that Shelby told her that she shot Eddie and that he was dead, and that there was another lady in the car and she had blacked out. She said that while she was standing there, the lady came to and said, "I'm pregnant." And so Shelby said that she did not shoot her again. Victoria said that after they went to a friend's house,
Victoria tells them the friend's name is Darian Melvin. She says that a few hours later, she dropped Shelby off with another friend, Gary Dotson.
Shelby and Victoria show up where Gary's staying. Victoria leaves in the silver Mitsubishi. Shelby stays there.
and then Victoria gets a call from her mom. And her mom wants to know, why is the police at her house?
Victoria swears she was not the one who pulled the trigger. But is she just trying to protect herself?
When Victoria named Shelby Isaac as the shooter, we didn't know if she was lying. We didn't know if she was trying to blame someone else.
At that time, we weren't 100% sure. Did we have the shooter or did we have the driver?
Police arrest Victoria C. while they work to figure out the truth of what happened.
Victoria, she was charged with accessory after the fact, which is a very, very low-grade felony.
Police cannot trust anything that Victoria says, and they have to corroborate everything that she just told them. So now they have to focus on where was Shelby at, and who is Shelby Isaacs?
The answer to those and many other questions lies in the next installment of this two-part special.
Are we 100% sure we got this right before we put murder charges on people?
If you follow the evidence, it does not lead you to Shelby. She's a good student, had her eyes on college.
Coming up, a surprising new claim reveals another possible suspect.
2 other witnesses described seeing a man on the scene.
And a trial that's one for the ages.
The judge didn't want to try this case.
I just screamed, I want justice for my child.
The judge says if you reach a verdict,
we didn't know which way it was going to go.
Be sure to find out how it all ends next time on Payback.
The first child disappeared without a sound. One moment he was part of an ordinary afternoon, surrounded by familiar streets, neighbors who knew his name, and the comforting certainty that home was only a few minutes away. The next moment there was nothing but silence. A bicycle left where it should not have been. Footprints that ended too soon. A mother standing on a porch, calling a name that echoed through the evening air until her voice cracked. Fathers searched fields with flashlights that grew dim as darkness settled over the countryside. Brothers and sisters waited at bedroom windows, convinced that any second a familiar figure would come walking back down the road. But the roads remained empty, and with every passing hour, hope slowly gave way to fear. At first, no one wanted to believe that evil had found its way into their quiet corner of Quebec. Children had always wandered between farms, crossed wooden bridges, and played beside rivers without anyone thinking twice. Doors were left unlocked. Families knew one another across generations. The rhythm of life was predictable, almost comforting. That illusion shattered one disappearance at a time. Parents who had once waved goodbye from their front steps now insisted on escorting their children everywhere. Schools dismissed students into the waiting arms of anxious adults. Conversations in grocery stores no longer centered on harvests or church events, but on whispered rumors. Had anyone seen a strange man? Had anyone noticed an unfamiliar car? Every unanswered question deepened the unease spreading through the community. Fear has a way of changing ordinary places. The same streets that had once carried laughter suddenly felt hostile. Every stretch of forest seemed capable of hiding something terrible. Every shadow cast by a fence or tree lingered a little too long. Children sensed the tension even when adults tried to shield them from it. They noticed their mothers locking doors during the day. They noticed fathers checking windows before bedtime. They noticed conversations that stopped the instant they entered the room. Without understanding why, they learned that something invisible had entered their lives. The newspapers searched for words strong enough to describe what was happening. Radio broadcasts interrupted regular programming with updates that offered little comfort. Police officers worked around the clock, chasing fragments of information that dissolved almost as quickly as they appeared. Every possible lead was followed. Every reported sighting was investigated. Volunteers combed fields, riverbanks, abandoned buildings, and dense woods. Entire communities united with one desperate purpose: bring the missing children home. Yet each search ended the same way, with exhausted faces returning after sunset carrying nothing except disappointment. Some monsters announce themselves through violence and chaos. Others wear ordinary clothes, smile politely, and disappear into the crowd without leaving the slightest impression. The man responsible for the growing nightmare understood something terrifying about human nature. He knew that children trusted easily. A kind voice, a harmless question, the promise of candy or a few coins. Sometimes that was all it took. He did not force his way into their lives. He invited himself into their trust. That was what made him so dangerous. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Years later, investigators would reconstruct pieces of those final encounters. A witness remembering a child speaking to a stranger. Another recalling a man standing quietly near a road. Small details dismissed at the time because they seemed too ordinary. Nobody imagines that an ordinary afternoon will become the beginning of a murder investigation. Nobody expects the smiling man nearby to be hunting. But predators rely on precisely that assumption. They thrive where people believe nothing terrible could possibly happen. The panic intensified with each new disappearance. Parents began counting heads constantly. Teachers refused to let students leave school alone. Local businesses closed earlier than usual because employees wanted to get their families safely inside before darkness arrived. Church congregations gathered not only to pray, but to comfort one another. Hope remained alive, but it became increasingly fragile. Every day without answers chipped away at the belief that the missing children would return alive. Behind the scenes, detectives faced an investigation unlike anything most of them had ever experienced. They were not searching for a robber or a man driven by revenge. They were hunting someone whose victims had nothing in common except innocence. The pattern disturbed experienced officers because it suggested something far more calculated than random violence. Someone was deliberately choosing children. Someone was patient enough to wait for the perfect opportunity. Someone knew how to vanish before suspicion could settle upon him. The pressure mounted not only from grieving families, but from an entire province demanding answers. Politicians asked difficult questions. Newspapers criticized the lack of progress. Every unsuccessful search increased public frustration. Yet despite the urgency, investigators possessed almost nothing they could use. There were no modern surveillance cameras, no mobile phone records, no DNA databases capable of identifying an unknown suspect within hours. Every clue depended on memory, observation, and persistence. Every mistake risked allowing the killer to strike again. As fear spread across Quebec, one name slowly emerged from the investigation. At first it appeared quietly, almost incidentally, among dozens of interviews and witness statements. Nothing about the man seemed extraordinary. He blended into the background with unsettling ease. He understood how to appear harmless. He knew when to speak and when to remain silent. Few people looking at him would have imagined that beneath the ordinary exterior lay impulses darker than anyone around him could comprehend. That man was Leopold Dion. History would eventually remember him by another name, the Monster of Pont Rouge. The nickname did not appear overnight. It grew from horror, from disbelief, from the realization that the person responsible for stealing children away from loving families was not an outsider passing through town, but a predator living among ordinary people. By the time investigators understood the scale of what they were facing, the damage had already become irreversible. The crimes attributed to Leopold Dion would shock Canada for generations. Officially, he would be convicted of 4 murders, yet many investigators remained convinced that the true number of victims would never be known. Some disappearances could never be conclusively linked to him. Some families would spend the rest of their lives wondering whether their child had crossed paths with the same killer. That uncertainty became one of the most painful legacies of the case. But before the courtroom, before the confessions, before the headlines that transformed him into one of Canada's most infamous serial killers, there were only frightened parents searching empty roads, detectives chasing invisible leads, and children who no longer felt safe walking through neighborhoods that had once seemed untouched by violence. This is the story of how one predator shattered that sense of security, how investigators slowly uncovered the truth hidden behind an ordinary face, and how an entire nation learned that sometimes the greatest danger is not the stranger everyone notices, but the one nobody remembers seeing at all. Long before the name Leopold Dion became synonymous with fear, Pont Rouge was the kind of place where life moved at an unhurried pace. Nestled in the province of Quebec, it was surrounded by forests, winding country roads, rivers, and farmland that stretched toward the horizon. Children grew up believing that the world beyond their front doors was safe. They rode bicycles until sunset, fished in nearby streams, climbed trees, and disappeared into patches of woodland with little more than a promise to be home before dinner. Parents rarely worried. Everyone seemed to know everyone else. If a child wandered too far, another adult in town would recognize them and point them back toward home. The years following the Second World War had brought optimism to many Canadian communities. Families worked hard, churches remained the center of social life, and neighborhoods were built upon trust rather than suspicion. Doors were often left unlocked. Cars remained parked with keys inside. Mothers chatted on front porches while their children played freely along dusty roads. It was not a perfect world, but it felt secure enough that danger seemed like something that happened somewhere else, somewhere far removed from quiet towns like Pont Rouge. That sense of security created an environment where predators could move almost unnoticed. Nobody imagined that someone could exploit the very trust that held the community together. Children had been taught to respect adults. If a grown man asked for directions or offered a small favor, refusing him felt almost impolite. Parents warned their sons and daughters about crossing busy roads or wandering near deep water, but very few imagined they also needed to warn them about a smiling stranger carrying candy in his pocket. Leopold Dion understood that world better than anyone. He knew how communities functioned. He knew what people expected to see, and more importantly, what they never expected. There was nothing about his outward appearance that immediately alarmed those around him. He was not constantly surrounded by violence or scandal. He did not present himself as a monster. Instead, he blended effortlessly into ordinary life, moving through neighborhoods without attracting lasting attention. To passing strangers, he was simply another face among many. Yet beneath that ordinary exterior, something profoundly disturbed was developing. Dion possessed an ability common among many serial offenders. He compartmentalized his life. To casual acquaintances, he could appear quiet or even polite. Internally, however, he nurtured fantasies that grew darker over time. Investigators would later conclude that his crimes were not impulsive explosions of violence. They reflected planning, opportunity, and an alarming willingness to manipulate vulnerable victims. As the late 1950s unfolded, Quebec itself was changing. Small towns remained rooted in traditional values, but modernization was slowly reaching the province. Roads improved, automobiles became more common, and communication between communities increased. Yet criminal investigations still relied heavily on eyewitness testimony and physical searches. There were no surveillance cameras mounted on street corners. There were no computerized criminal databases capable of instantly connecting similar crimes across jurisdictions. If a child disappeared, investigators depended almost entirely upon neighbors remembering unusual conversations, unfamiliar vehicles, or strangers seen near the area. That limitation would prove devastating. The first disappearances did not immediately suggest a serial predator. Missing children were tragically uncommon, but not impossible to explain. Some youngsters wandered away. Others became lost while exploring woods or rivers. Police initially approached each report individually, believing each case might have its own explanation. Search teams organized quickly, volunteers combed forests, and local newspapers published photographs of smiling children beneath hopeful headlines asking readers to assist in the search. Every passing hour without results increased anxiety, but few imagined they were witnessing the beginning of a pattern. Families responded in different ways. Some convinced themselves their child would return at any moment, refusing to leave the front porch in case they appeared walking down the road. Others joined search parties despite exhaustion, unwilling to surrender even a single hour that might save a loved one. Entire communities mobilized. Farmers searched their fields before sunrise. Hunters combed wooded trails they knew better than anyone else. Church bells rang as congregations gathered to pray for miracles. Hope persisted because surrendering hope felt impossible. But hope became harder to sustain with every unanswered question. Police interviews began revealing unsettling similarities. The victims were young boys. They often disappeared while traveling alone for only a short distance. None of them appeared to have resisted openly. There were rarely signs of struggle where they vanished. It was almost as though they had willingly gone with someone they believed they could trust. That realization transformed the investigation. Officers were no longer searching for accidents or runaways. They were searching for someone capable of convincing children to leave voluntarily. The realization haunted investigators because it narrowed the possibilities dramatically. Whoever was responsible understood children. He understood how to approach them without causing immediate alarm. He knew when adults were unlikely to be watching. He waited patiently until opportunity presented itself. These were not random crimes driven by sudden rage. They reflected patience, calculation, and confidence. Meanwhile, parents across Quebec quietly rewrote the rules of everyday life. Children who had once walked to school alone were now accompanied by older siblings or adults. Mothers insisted their sons come directly home after classes instead of stopping to play with friends. Evening curfews arrived earlier than before. Local police visited schools, reminding students never to leave with strangers, no matter how friendly they appeared. Those conversations, almost unheard of only a few years earlier, became routine. Yet even heightened vigilance could not completely eliminate opportunity. Dion remained patient. He understood that fear eventually settles into routine. Communities cannot remain on constant alert forever. Life must continue. Children still attended school. Families still worked. Moments of vulnerability inevitably returned, and Dion exploited them with chilling precision. What made the investigation especially frustrating was the absence of obvious suspects. Detectives interviewed dozens of individuals. They questioned known offenders, drifters passing through the region, and anyone reported behaving strangely around children. Many leads appeared promising before collapsing under closer examination. Every false lead consumed valuable time while the killer remained free. Behind closed doors, frustration grew among investigators. They recognized they were chasing someone who adapted quickly. Each unsuccessful search increased public pressure. Newspapers criticized police efforts. Families demanded answers. Politicians requested updates. Detectives carried not only the burden of solving the crimes, but also the weight of knowing another child could disappear before they uncovered the truth. Years later, criminal profilers would point to Leopold Dion as an early example of a sexually motivated serial killer whose behavior reflected recognizable patterns. At the time, however, such concepts remained poorly understood. Investigators lacked many of the behavioral tools available to modern law enforcement. They focused primarily upon evidence rather than psychological patterns, making it more difficult to recognize the offender's evolving methods. Despite these obstacles, one undeniable truth slowly emerged. The disappearances were connected. Someone was deliberately hunting children. The realization transformed isolated tragedies into one of the largest criminal investigations Quebec had ever experienced. No parent slept peacefully anymore. Every delayed return home triggered panic. Every unfamiliar face walking through town attracted suspicious glances. Children sensed the fear surrounding them even if adults tried to hide it. Games ended earlier. Laughter became less frequent. The innocence that had defined communities like Pont Rouge slowly disappeared, replaced by constant uncertainty. And somewhere among those frightened streets, Leopold Dion continued watching, waiting, and searching for his next opportunity, unaware that the smallest mistake would eventually unravel the carefully constructed illusion that had protected him for years. Before history reduced them to names on police reports and faded newspaper headlines, they were simply children. They were sons whose muddy boots were left beside front doors every evening. They were brothers who argued over toys, chased one another through fields, laughed until they fell into the grass, and believed every summer day would last forever. Their worlds were measured in schoolyards, church picnics, bicycles, baseball gloves, and family dinners. They had no reason to imagine that somewhere nearby an adult was quietly watching them, studying routines that seemed too ordinary to notice, but would one day become deadly. One little boy loved collecting smooth stones from the edge of a creek that ran behind his family's property. Whenever his pockets became too heavy, his mother would laugh as she emptied them before washing his clothes. She teased him that one day he would bring home enough rocks to build his own castle. He always answered with complete seriousness that he planned to build one for her instead. It was the kind of conversation that seemed insignificant while it happened. Yet after he disappeared, it became one of the memories his mother replayed every night, clinging desperately to the sound of his voice because she feared she might someday forget it. Another child dreamed of becoming a firefighter. Every passing fire truck fascinated him. If he heard a siren in the distance, he abandoned whatever game he was playing and raced to the roadside just to watch the flashing lights disappear over the hill. His father promised that when he grew older they would visit the local fire station together. That promise remained unfulfilled. Years later, his father would still keep the small red toy fire engine sitting untouched on a bedroom shelf, unable to bring himself to pack away belongings that represented a future stolen before it could begin. Many of the boys came from hardworking families whose lives revolved around church, school, and community. Their parents woke before sunrise to work farms, factories, or construction jobs. Mothers prepared lunches before children hurried off carrying worn school bags and carefully wrapped sandwiches. Evenings were simple but meaningful. Families gathered around dinner tables, shared stories about school, discussed weekend plans, and ended the day believing tomorrow would look much the same as today. That ordinary routine became one of the cruelest aspects of the tragedy. Evil did not invade during dramatic moments. It slipped quietly into completely normal afternoons. A child walking home from school. Another sent to buy bread at a nearby store. Someone riding a bicycle only a few streets away from home. Their disappearances occurred within moments so ordinary that parents initially assumed nothing could possibly have gone wrong. As investigators later reconstructed the victims' final hours, heartbreaking details emerged. One boy had kissed his mother goodbye before leaving the house, promising he would return in time for supper. Another had asked permission to visit a friend only a short distance away. A third insisted he could make the trip alone because he had walked the same route countless times before. None of those decisions seemed dangerous. Every family believed they were granting permission for one more perfectly ordinary childhood adventure. The communities remembered the victims not through the horror of their deaths, but through the joy they brought while alive. Teachers described curious students who asked endless questions during class. Coaches remembered boys who celebrated every small victory as though they had won championships. Neighbors recalled children eager to help carry groceries or shovel snow without expecting anything in return. They were not statistics. They were vibrant personalities whose absence left empty chairs at school, silent bedrooms at home, and families forever divided between life before and life after. Parents responded to the disappearances with an agonizing mixture of hope and despair. During the first hours, they convinced themselves there had to be a reasonable explanation. Perhaps their son had lost track of time while playing. Perhaps he had accepted dinner at a friend's house without telling anyone. Perhaps his bicycle chain had broken somewhere along the road. They searched familiar places first because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. As daylight faded, hope transformed into urgency. Flashlights swept across fields and wooded trails. Volunteers called children's names until their throats became raw. Dogs barked into darkness as search parties pushed deeper into forests illuminated only by moonlight. Every rustling branch caused hearts to race. Every distant sound triggered another frantic search. Yet each promising moment ended in disappointment. A jacket hanging from a fence. A bicycle belonging to someone else. Footprints washed away by rain. The night always ended the same way, with exhausted families returning home to empty bedrooms. The emotional toll reached beyond immediate relatives. Entire classrooms struggled to understand why one desk remained empty. Younger siblings waited at windows believing their brother might still come home. Grandparents refused to stop preparing favorite meals because accepting the possibility of death felt like surrender. Christmas presents remained hidden away. Birthday gifts sat unopened in closets. Families suspended ordinary life because moving forward without answers seemed impossible. The surviving children of Quebec carried invisible wounds of their own. They watched adults whisper nervously whenever another disappearance was reported. They noticed classmates suddenly escorted everywhere by worried parents. Playgrounds emptied earlier than before. Games once filled with carefree laughter became cautious and brief. Childhood itself seemed to shrink under the weight of fear. Every unfamiliar adult became someone to avoid. Every invitation from a stranger became something frightening rather than friendly. For detectives, each victim represented not only another murdered child, but another devastated family waiting desperately for justice. Investigators spent countless hours interviewing grieving parents, asking painful questions about routines, friendships, favorite places, and final conversations. They understood that every tiny detail might matter. What color shirt had the child been wearing? Had anyone unusual been seen nearby? Did the victim ever mention meeting someone new? Questions that sounded clinical often reopened fresh emotional wounds. Yet families answered them repeatedly, because even the smallest memory might help stop whoever was responsible. One investigator later admitted that the hardest part of the case was walking into children's bedrooms after they vanished. Toys remained scattered across floors exactly where they had been left. Schoolbooks lay open on desks beside unfinished homework. Posters decorated walls above neatly made beds that would never again be slept in. Those rooms felt suspended in time, frozen between ordinary life and unimaginable tragedy. Officers left carrying more than evidence. They carried the weight of knowing that every unanswered question represented another family trapped inside unbearable uncertainty. As years passed, public attention naturally focused upon Leopold Dion himself. His name became infamous. His crimes became part of Canadian criminal history. Yet the victims deserved to remain at the center of the story. Their lives were measured not by the violence inflicted upon them, but by the love surrounding them. Every photograph preserved by their families showed smiling faces, scraped knees from childhood adventures, birthday cakes, fishing trips, and school portraits. Those images reminded everyone that before they became victims, they had simply been children living ordinary lives filled with extraordinary promise. That promise was exactly what Dion stole. He did not merely end lives. He robbed families of graduations they would never attend, weddings they would never witness, grandchildren who would never be born, and decades of memories that should have existed but never would. Every victim represented an entire future erased. The growing number of grieving families also transformed public opinion. The crimes were no longer isolated tragedies discussed quietly within individual communities. They became a provincial crisis. Parents who had never met one another suddenly shared the same unbearable fear. Every disappearance reminded them that the next victim could just as easily be their own child. The collective grief united Quebec in ways few events ever had, while simultaneously exposing just how vulnerable innocence could be when confronted by calculated evil. Long before detectives uncovered the identity of the man responsible, the victims themselves had already changed Canada forever. Their disappearances forced families, educators, police officers, and lawmakers to reconsider assumptions that had once seemed unquestionable. Childhood could no longer rely solely upon trust. Communities would never again view quiet streets with the same innocence they once had. And although justice would eventually arrive, nothing could restore the futures stolen from the little boys whose only mistake had been believing they lived in a world where adults could always be trusted. At first, no one realized there was a pattern. A missing child was every parent's nightmare, but tragic accidents happened. Children wandered farther than they intended. They became lost in forests, slipped into rivers, or accepted rides from neighbors without telling anyone. Every explanation seemed more comforting than the possibility that someone was deliberately hunting young boys. That illusion lasted only until another child disappeared, then another, each case leaving behind the same unbearable silence and the same desperate questions. Leopold Dion understood that fear rarely arrived all at once. It crept forward slowly, hidden behind ordinary moments. He never rushed. He never forced his way into crowded places. He searched patiently for boys who had drifted just far enough away from adults to become vulnerable. He watched schoolyards from a distance, lingered near quiet streets, and memorized routines. He noticed which children walked home alone, which families allowed their sons to run errands independently, and which neighborhoods still believed strangers could be trusted. His greatest weapon was not physical strength. It was deception. Children had been taught to obey adults. They were expected to answer politely when spoken to. Dion exploited that lesson with terrifying precision. Sometimes he approached with a friendly smile, speaking calmly enough to erase suspicion before it could form. Sometimes he offered candy or loose coins. Other times he invented small requests for help that sounded harmless to an innocent child eager to please. To a frightened adult looking backward through the investigation, the traps seemed obvious. To a curious 8-year-old standing alone on a quiet afternoon, they appeared completely ordinary. Witnesses who later described Dion rarely remembered anything dramatic about him. That was exactly why he succeeded. His clothing was unremarkable. His voice remained steady. He blended into the environment so naturally that people struggled to remember details afterward. They recalled seeing a man speaking with a child, but nothing about the conversation seemed alarming enough to interrupt. By the time concern emerged, both had disappeared. Investigators would later conclude that Dion carefully selected locations where he could isolate his victims within minutes. Quiet country roads bordered by dense woods offered concealment. Empty fields provided privacy. Abandoned paths allowed him to move quickly without attracting attention. Every decision reflected preparation rather than impulse. His crimes were brutal, but they were also methodical. The attacks themselves revealed a disturbing psychological pattern. Dion was driven by deviant sexual fantasies that escalated into murder. Violence became intertwined with domination. He sought complete control over children who were physically incapable of defending themselves. Every victim represented not only another life destroyed, but another opportunity for him to satisfy impulses growing more dangerous with each successful crime. Instead of diminishing after an attack, his confidence increased. Each escape reinforced the belief that he was untouchable. Families only learned fragments of what happened because the victims could never tell their stories. Detectives reconstructed timelines through scattered evidence, footprints, discarded clothing, and the heartbreaking testimony of children who had unknowingly seen Dion speaking to one of the boys shortly before they vanished. Those final sightings became almost unbearable to review. One witness remembered seeing the child smiling politely. Another believed they recognized the strange man, but could not remember where. None realized they had just witnessed the last moments before innocence disappeared forever. The emotional devastation spread rapidly through Quebec. Every new disappearance seemed to erase another piece of normal life. Parents no longer allowed children to play unsupervised. Teachers counted students repeatedly before dismissing classes. Church groups organized escorts so youngsters would not walk home alone. Newspapers printed photographs of missing boys beside increasingly urgent headlines. Radio broadcasts interrupted regular programming with appeals for information. Entire communities lived beneath a cloud of constant anxiety. Meanwhile, Dion continued moving almost unnoticed. His ability to maintain an outward appearance of normality remains one of the most chilling aspects of the case. He was capable of carrying on ordinary conversations shortly after committing horrific crimes. He understood how to separate his public identity from his secret life. That emotional detachment confused investigators once they finally began examining his behavior more closely. People who had encountered him casually struggled to reconcile the polite man they remembered with the predator police described. As disappearances multiplied, detectives recognized they were facing an offender unlike any they had previously encountered. Search operations expanded dramatically. Hundreds of volunteers gathered whenever another child vanished. Police officers searched rivers with boats, forests with dogs, and abandoned buildings room by room. Helicopters were not yet routinely available for every investigation, making searches painfully slow. Thick woodland had to be examined by people walking shoulder to shoulder through dense undergrowth, hoping to discover any trace before darkness forced them to stop. Every unsuccessful search increased pressure upon investigators. Families demanded answers. Newspapers questioned police strategy. Politicians promised additional resources. Detectives worked around the clock, reviewing witness statements again and again, searching for overlooked connections. Yet the killer remained several steps ahead. He understood that time favored him. Every passing day erased footprints, blurred memories, and reduced the likelihood that witnesses would remember precise details. Dion's confidence grew alongside public fear. Instead of retreating after each murder, he continued searching for opportunities. Experts later argued that serial offenders often experience an escalating cycle in which fantasies become increasingly difficult to control. Temporary satisfaction fades quickly, replaced by renewed compulsion. Dion appeared to fit that pattern. His crimes occurred over several years because the underlying psychological drive never disappeared. Each successful escape encouraged another attack. The victims' families unknowingly became connected through shared grief. Parents who had never met before embraced during search efforts. Mothers exchanged photographs of their missing sons while praying for impossible miracles. Fathers volunteered together through freezing nights, refusing to stop despite exhaustion. They all believed that if enough people searched hard enough, somehow the next child might still be found alive. That hope slowly gave way to something darker. When investigators recovered evidence confirming that several boys had been murdered, optimism vanished. Search parties no longer expected miraculous reunions. They searched because families deserved answers, however painful those answers might be. The atmosphere changed completely. Volunteers spoke less. Conversations became whispers. Every discovery, no matter how small, carried enormous emotional weight. Police also noticed another unsettling detail. The victims shared striking similarities in age and appearance. Dion clearly preferred young boys who projected innocence and vulnerability. His choices were not random. They reflected a specific psychological fixation that helped investigators narrow their profile. They were searching for someone whose crimes were sexually motivated, someone comfortable approaching children, someone capable of appearing harmless until the moment he struck. Still, identifying that individual proved extraordinarily difficult. The absence of modern forensic technology meant investigators relied heavily upon traditional police work. Fingerprints rarely existed. DNA testing had not yet revolutionized criminal investigations. Surveillance footage was non-existent. Cases depended upon interviews, physical searches, and painstaking comparison of witness accounts. Every small inconsistency had to be examined manually. Every possible suspect required lengthy investigation. Dion benefited from every limitation. Yet even the most careful predator eventually makes mistakes. Without realizing it, Dion had already begun leaving behind subtle clues. Not dramatic pieces of evidence pointing directly toward him, but behavioral patterns impossible to ignore forever. The same geographical areas. The same victim profile. The same method of approaching children. Slowly, investigators stopped treating each disappearance as an isolated tragedy and instead recognized they were hunting one man. The realization marked a turning point. Quebec was no longer confronting unexplained disappearances. It was confronting an organized child predator whose confidence continued growing with every successful attack. Detectives understood that unless they identified him soon, another family would receive the same devastating knock at the door. Another bedroom would remain forever empty, and another little boy would vanish into the shadows created by Leopold Dion's carefully constructed deception. Every disappearance ended the same way. At first there was hope. Then came urgency. Finally, there was silence broken only by the voices of police officers delivering news no family should ever hear. Kitchens filled with neighbors bringing untouched meals. Living rooms became crowded with relatives who had no words capable of easing the pain. Children's bedrooms remained exactly as they had been left, beds neatly made, favorite toys waiting patiently for hands that would never return. For investigators, these rooms became heartbreaking reminders that they were not simply working homicide cases. They were racing against a predator who kept leaving behind shattered families. The crime scenes themselves revealed almost nothing at first glance. Dion understood the importance of isolation. He selected locations where nature erased evidence almost as efficiently as he did. Rain softened footprints. Wind scattered loose fibers. Wildlife disturbed the ground before investigators could arrive. By the time search teams discovered the victims, valuable hours or even days had already passed. Detectives were often forced to reconstruct events from fragments rather than complete scenes. Forensic science during the late 1950s and early 1960s lacked many of the tools investigators depend upon today. There was no DNA analysis capable of identifying microscopic traces left by an offender. Surveillance cameras did not document streets or store entrances. Digital records did not exist. Every clue had to be discovered with the naked eye, preserved carefully, and interpreted through experience rather than advanced technology. A single misplaced footprint, a damaged branch, or an unusual tire impression could become the difference between progress and another dead end. Each search operation followed a similar pattern. Officers established a command post near the child's last known location. Volunteers gathered in church parking lots before sunrise, receiving instructions from exhausted detectives who had barely slept. Maps were divided into grids. Teams carrying flashlights, ropes, and radios spread across fields, rivers, wooded trails, and abandoned buildings. Search dogs worked tirelessly, their handlers watching every movement for signs they had picked up a scent. Parents refused to remain behind. Many insisted on joining the searches despite officers' concerns about emotional strain. The atmosphere during those operations was unlike anything most participants had ever experienced. No one spoke loudly. Every discovery, even something as ordinary as a discarded glove or bicycle track, caused searchers to freeze while investigators examined it. Hearts raced with every announcement over portable radios. Sometimes hope surged briefly before collapsing into disappointment. A child spotted in the distance turned out to be someone else's son. Fresh footprints belonged to hikers. Clothing discovered near a creek had been abandoned months earlier. When evidence finally confirmed another murder, investigators approached the recovery site with extraordinary caution. Photographers documented every angle before anything moved. Measuring tapes stretched across disturbed ground. Detectives knelt for hours studying impressions invisible to untrained eyes. They searched surrounding vegetation for broken branches that might indicate how bodies had been transported. Every blade of grass seemed capable of holding an answer. The medical examinations added another disturbing layer to the investigation. Pathologists confirmed that the victims had suffered sexual assaults before death. The injuries displayed consistent characteristics that immediately suggested a single offender rather than unrelated crimes. The killer demonstrated the same behavioral pattern repeatedly. He targeted similar victims, used comparable methods of control, and disposed of bodies in ways reflecting both planning and familiarity with isolated terrain. That realization fundamentally changed the investigation. Police no longer viewed the murders as isolated tragedies connected only by geography. They recognized behavioral consistency. Somewhere in Quebec, one individual was repeating the same cycle over and over. He located vulnerable boys, gained their trust, isolated them, assaulted them, murdered them, and disappeared before anyone realized a crime had occurred. Detectives now faced not merely a murderer, but what would later be understood as a serial sexual predator. Investigators began constructing detailed profiles long before modern behavioral analysis officially existed. They concluded the offender likely lived locally because he appeared comfortable navigating rural areas without attracting attention. He probably held employment that allowed him freedom to move during daylight hours. He demonstrated enough confidence interacting with children that he likely possessed an outwardly respectable appearance. Most importantly, he almost certainly watched communities carefully before striking. These conclusions narrowed possibilities only slightly. Thousands of men fit portions of the description. Detectives interviewed laborers, delivery drivers, traveling salesmen, maintenance workers, and anyone whose routines brought them into contact with children. Every suspicious complaint received attention. Every rumor circulated through neighborhoods required investigation. Police chased dozens of leads that ultimately produced nothing. Meanwhile, fear transformed daily life throughout the province. School principals introduced stricter dismissal procedures. Teachers refused to let younger students leave classrooms without confirming someone waited outside. Parents organized neighborhood walking groups so children would never travel alone. Churches reminded families to remain vigilant. Newspapers printed practical safety advice beside increasingly grim headlines. What had once been common childhood independence vanished almost overnight. Boys who previously spent entire afternoons exploring fields suddenly found themselves escorted everywhere by anxious adults. Detectives also examined reports that had initially seemed unrelated. Several parents remembered their sons mentioning friendly conversations with unfamiliar men shortly before disappearing. Some boys described offers of candy. Others mentioned coins or promises of seeing something interesting nearby. Individually, those encounters appeared insignificant. Together, they revealed a consistent grooming strategy. The offender rarely relied upon force initially. He relied upon manipulation. The challenge lay in identifying someone whose public behavior appeared completely ordinary. Witnesses consistently described a man who did not seem threatening. He smiled. He spoke calmly. He dressed like countless other adults encountered every day. No obvious scars, unusual clothing, or memorable mannerisms distinguished him from everyone else. That normal appearance became one of his greatest protections. People noticed nothing because nothing seemed worth remembering until after another child vanished. Investigators became increasingly frustrated by how close they often came without realizing it. One officer later admitted they likely interviewed individuals who had unknowingly encountered the killer only hours before another disappearance. Unfortunately, those witnesses possessed no reason to pay close attention at the time. Human memory naturally overlooks ordinary interactions. By the time police asked questions days later, crucial details had already faded. The emotional burden upon investigators became almost unbearable. Many officers had children the same age as the victims. Every recovered body reminded them of their own families waiting safely at home. Some detectives avoided discussing cases with spouses because they feared spreading the same terror consuming every investigation. Others threw themselves deeper into work, believing every additional hour spent searching might prevent another murder. Communities responded by supporting police however they could. Volunteers distributed missing person posters across towns and villages. Businesses displayed photographs in storefront windows. Local radio stations interrupted programming whenever another child disappeared. Farmers allowed officers unrestricted access to private land. Hunters familiar with remote forests guided search teams through difficult terrain. Entire regions united behind one shared objective: finding the man responsible before another family suffered. Yet despite enormous effort, the investigation continued producing more grief than answers. The killer remained invisible while the victims became tragically familiar. Detectives developed thick case files documenting each boy's final movements, family history, physical description, and recovered evidence. Maps covering police station walls filled with colored pins marking disappearances, body recovery locations, witness sightings, and search zones. Gradually, patterns emerged. The geographic distribution suggested someone operating within a relatively limited area. The timing indicated increasing confidence. Every attack seemed slightly bolder than the last. Experienced investigators recognized a dangerous truth. Serial offenders who escape capture rarely stop voluntarily. Success reinforces behavior. Every failure by police becomes psychological encouragement for the killer. Unless something interrupted the pattern, an arrest, death, or dramatic mistake, another victim almost certainly awaited. That realization changed the investigation from reactive to proactive. Detectives intensified patrols near schools, monitored locations where children frequently gathered, and instructed officers to question unfamiliar adults lingering without clear purpose. They hoped increased visibility might discourage the offender or provoke a mistake. Unknown to them, Leopold Dion had already begun making exactly those mistakes. They were subtle, almost invisible beneath his carefully maintained public persona, But each successful crime increased his confidence. Confidence often becomes the first crack in even the most carefully constructed disguise. Investigators did not know his name yet, but they were closer than they realized to uncovering the identity of the man newspapers had begun calling the monster of Pont Rouge. By the beginning of the 1960s, the investigation had become more than a collection of murder cases. It had turned into an exhausting battle between detectives desperate to stop a predator and a man who seemed to understand exactly how to remain invisible. Every new disappearance intensified the pressure. Newspapers questioned whether the police were capable of protecting children. Parents demanded answers at town meetings. Politicians promised additional resources, but promises alone could not identify a killer who left behind so little physical evidence. The detectives assigned to the case found themselves trapped inside an endless cycle. A child disappeared. Officers flooded the area. Hundreds of volunteers searched forests and fields. Witnesses were interviewed until their voices became hoarse from repeating the same details. Then another family entered the same nightmare weeks or months later. It felt as though they were always arriving one step too late. Investigators expanded the list of possible suspects until it filled filing cabinets. Every man with a history of sexual misconduct was questioned. Individuals convicted of assaults against children were tracked down, even if they had moved to neighboring communities. Traveling workers, drifters, carnival employees, delivery drivers, and men with no fixed address were investigated one after another. Detectives compared employment records, vehicle registrations, and criminal histories, hoping one name would appear repeatedly across multiple locations. Most inquiries ended in disappointment. Some suspects had solid alibis confirmed by multiple witnesses. Others had been hundreds of kilometers away when the murders occurred. A few appeared suspicious enough to justify surveillance, only for weeks of observation to reveal nothing more sinister than ordinary daily routines. Every false lead consumed precious time while the real killer remained free. One theory suggested that the murderer might be an outsider traveling through Quebec. Another argued the opposite, that only someone deeply familiar with local roads and wooded areas could repeatedly disappear without attracting attention. Detectives debated the issue constantly. Maps spread across conference tables showed the locations where boys had last been seen, where bodies had later been recovered, and where witnesses reported unfamiliar men speaking with children. The distances between those points gradually convinced investigators that the offender knew the region exceptionally well. They also noticed something increasingly significant about the timing of the attacks. Many occurred during ordinary afternoons when children walked home from school, visited neighborhood stores, or played just far enough from adult supervision to become isolated. The killer seemed to understand family routines almost as well as the families themselves. He struck during moments when parents believed their children were safest because danger appeared impossible in broad daylight. That observation narrowed the psychological profile further. The offender demonstrated extraordinary patience. He was not selecting victims randomly. He observed before approaching. He waited for opportunities instead of forcing them. Such behavior suggested a man capable of controlling his impulses for extended periods before acting with terrifying efficiency. Detectives concluded they were hunting someone disciplined enough to maintain a normal public life while secretly nurturing violent fantasies. Meanwhile, the public atmosphere grew increasingly hostile. Rumors spread faster than verified information. Innocent men found themselves accused simply because they lived alone or behaved awkwardly around neighbors. Parents warned children about specific individuals based on gossip rather than evidence. Anonymous phone calls poured into police stations every day, naming coworkers, relatives, or complete strangers as possible murderers. Investigators were obligated to examine every credible report, even when experience suggested most would lead nowhere. The emotional strain reached detectives as well. Some officers admitted privately that they had begun questioning their own instincts. Had they overlooked an obvious clue months earlier? Had one insignificant witness statement contained the answer all along? Every unsolved case carries frustration, but serial investigations create something worse. The constant awareness that failure today may produce another victim tomorrow. Then, almost unexpectedly, attention began turning toward a man whose name had surfaced before but never commanded sustained focus. Leopold Dion did not initially appear dramatically different from dozens of other individuals interviewed during the investigation. He was young, local, and outwardly unremarkable. But as detectives examined his background more carefully, disturbing inconsistencies emerged. His work history lacked stability. His explanations regarding certain movements seemed vague. More importantly, there were reports linking him to inappropriate behavior involving young boys. At first, those reports remained circumstantial. No witness had seen him committing murder. No physical evidence directly connected him to the victims. But detectives understood that behavioral evidence sometimes reveals patterns long before forensic science can confirm them. Dion had repeatedly placed himself in situations involving children. Several people remembered seeing him speaking to boys in neighborhoods where disappearances later occurred. Others recalled interactions that had seemed harmless at the time but appeared unsettling once viewed through the lens of the investigation. Police intensified surveillance. Officers quietly observed Dion's movements without informing the public. They followed him through neighborhoods, noting where he stopped and whom he approached. Detectives interviewed acquaintances who described him as socially awkward, yet capable of appearing friendly when necessary. Some remembered his fascination with children, but had dismissed it as eccentric rather than dangerous. Others admitted feeling uncomfortable around him without being able to explain why. The deeper investigators looked, the more troubling the picture became. Psychiatrists consulted by police described offenders who targeted children as individuals capable of living seemingly ordinary lives while maintaining elaborate secret fantasies. Such offenders often rehearsed crimes mentally long before acting. They learned how to appear trustworthy. They avoided attracting attention. Dion's behavior increasingly matched those descriptions. Still, investigators needed proof. Without direct evidence, prosecutors could not secure convictions. Detectives therefore focused on identifying surviving witnesses whose memories might connect Dion to specific disappearances. Officers revisited neighborhoods repeatedly, interviewing children with extraordinary care. Young witnesses often remembered details adults overlooked. The color of a bicycle, the sound of a voice, or the candy offered by a stranger. Investigators used maps, photographs, and patient questioning to help reconstruct forgotten encounters. Gradually, fragments began fitting together. One boy remembered seeing Dion near a playground shortly before another child vanished. Another recalled being approached by a man matching his description but running home before accepting candy. A shopkeeper vaguely recognized him from afternoons when several victims had been nearby. None of these observations alone solved the case. Together, they transformed Dion from one name among hundreds into the investigation's primary focus. The pressure upon him quietly increased. Although Dion continued trying to present himself as ordinary, detectives noticed subtle changes. He appeared increasingly nervous during interviews. His explanations shifted slightly between conversations. Small contradictions emerged regarding dates and locations. Experienced investigators recognized these inconsistencies as possible signs of deception rather than simple forgetfulness. At the same time, forensic specialists re-examined evidence collected over several years. Clothing fibers, footprints, handwritten notes, and recovered objects received renewed attention. Technology remained limited compared with modern standards, but investigators understood that fresh eyes sometimes discover connections missed during earlier examinations. The community remained unaware of how close police believed they were to identifying the monster of Pont Rouge. Parents continued escorting children everywhere. Schools maintained heightened security. Newspapers published updates almost daily, though investigators carefully withheld certain information to avoid alerting their suspect. Detectives feared that if Dion realized he had become the primary target, he might flee, destroy evidence, or claim another victim before police could act. The investigation entered its most delicate stage. Years of frustration had finally produced a suspect whose behavior aligned with the psychological profile, whose movements overlapped with multiple disappearances, and whose interactions with children appeared increasingly suspicious. Yet suspicion alone could not end the nightmare haunting Quebec. Detectives needed the one mistake every serial offender eventually makes: the single crack in the carefully constructed facade that would allow them to move from theory to certainty. For Leopold Dion, that mistake was closer than he realized. The breakthrough did not arrive as a dramatic confession or a miraculous piece of forensic evidence. Instead, it emerged the way many of the most important developments in criminal investigations do: through relentless persistence, countless interviews, and detectives refusing to abandon details that had once seemed too small to matter. After years of fear, frustration, and heartbreaking failure, the investigation surrounding Leopold Dion finally began moving in one unmistakable direction. Investigators had reached a point where they no longer viewed Dion as simply another suspicious man in Quebec. His name kept resurfacing whenever detectives reconstructed the final movements of the victims. His routine placed him near neighborhoods where children had disappeared. Witnesses who had initially dismissed their encounters with him gradually began remembering additional details as investigators patiently revisited every interview. A stranger who had once seemed forgettable suddenly became impossible to ignore. The detectives understood something equally important. Serial offenders rarely stop because of guilt. They stop only when something interrupts them. Every day Dion remained free increased the possibility that another child would vanish. That knowledge transformed the investigation from a methodical inquiry into a race against time. Police intensified their surveillance without attracting public attention. Plainclothes officers quietly followed Dion through Pont Rouge and neighboring communities. They documented his movements from morning until late evening. Every place he visited, every person he spoke to, every unusual detour became another entry inside growing investigative files. Detectives wanted to understand his habits before making their move. What they observed disturbed them. Whenever Dion believed nobody was paying attention, he displayed an unsettling interest in young boys. He lingered near parks longer than necessary. He slowed his pace whenever children played nearby. He frequently appeared in locations where boys walked home from school alone. None of those actions alone justified an arrest. Together they formed a behavioral pattern almost impossible to dismiss. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining Dion's past. Friends and acquaintances described a man who struggled to maintain stable employment. Employers remembered him as capable enough to perform routine tasks but unreliable when supervision disappeared. Neighbors often considered him quiet, withdrawn, and socially awkward. Few described him as openly violent. That contradiction fascinated investigators because it reflected one of the most dangerous realities about predatory offenders. Many never appear monstrous to those who know them casually. Psychological experts assisting the investigation reviewed Dion's background alongside the crimes themselves. They concluded that the offender likely possessed profound emotional immaturity combined with compulsive sexual interests focused exclusively on young boys. He demonstrated planning rather than impulsiveness. He chose victims carefully. He understood how to earn trust quickly before isolating children beyond the view of adults. Dion fit that profile with unsettling precision. Still, prosecutors required stronger evidence. Detectives therefore returned once again to surviving children who had encountered suspicious strangers during previous years. Unlike adult witnesses, children often remembered emotional impressions instead of physical descriptions. Investigators adapted their questioning accordingly. Instead of asking whether the man had blue eyes or brown hair, they asked how he spoke, whether he smiled, what promises he made, and whether anything about him felt unusual. One recurring detail began appearing repeatedly. Several boys independently described a friendly man who offered treats or small rewards while speaking with unusual confidence, as though approaching unfamiliar children was completely natural for him. Some accepted the conversation only briefly before walking away. Others remembered feeling uncomfortable despite not understanding why. The descriptions consistently resembled Leopold Dion. At nearly the same time, detectives uncovered additional information regarding Dion's history of sexual misconduct. Previous incidents that had never resulted in major criminal proceedings suddenly gained enormous significance. They revealed behavior escalating over time rather than appearing suddenly. Investigators recognized the familiar progression seen in many serial predators. Boundary violations grew gradually more serious until they culminated in murder. The investigative team realized they could no longer wait. Police detained Dion for another intensive interview. Unlike previous conversations, detectives now possessed years of accumulated information. They confronted him with witness statements collected from multiple communities. They questioned inconsistencies in his timeline. They challenged explanations that had previously gone untested. Hour after hour, investigators dismantled the carefully constructed image Dion had maintained. Those present later recalled noticeable changes in his demeanor. At first he answered calmly, almost casually, dismissing accusations as misunderstandings. As questioning continued, confidence slowly disappeared. His responses became shorter. Long pauses interrupted conversations. He struggled to explain why so many unrelated witnesses remembered encountering him near children who later vanished. Detectives sensed the psychological pressure building. Although Dion never immediately offered investigators the complete truth, cracks had finally appeared. Searches connected to the investigation uncovered additional evidence linking him to the crimes. Combined with witness testimony and behavioral patterns, authorities believed they now possessed enough to proceed formally. Leopold Dion was arrested. News of the arrest spread across Quebec with astonishing speed. For years, families had lived beneath the shadow of an invisible monster. Parents who had spent countless afternoons searching forests for missing children suddenly heard that police believed they had finally captured the man responsible. Newspapers rushed special editions into circulation. Radio stations interrupted programming. Entire neighborhoods gathered around televisions, hoping for confirmation that the nightmare might truly be ending. Relief, however, arrived cautiously. Experienced investigators warned everyone that arresting a suspect represented only one step. The legal system still required proof beyond reasonable doubt. Every piece of evidence had to withstand courtroom scrutiny. Detectives therefore continued working almost without pause, determined to build the strongest possible case. As the investigation expanded, Dion's own statements became increasingly revealing. He admitted to numerous sexual offenses involving young boys. Some admissions aligned closely with evidence investigators had collected over previous years. Others introduced entirely new possibilities regarding additional victims whose disappearances had never been fully explained. Detectives carefully compared every statement against existing files, separating verifiable facts from attempts to confuse investigators. The picture that emerged proved even darker than many had imagined. Authorities became convinced that the 4 murders for which Dion would ultimately stand trial represented only part of his criminal history. Numerous unsolved disappearances bore striking similarities to his known crimes. Because forensic science remained limited and some evidence had disappeared over time, investigators could not conclusively attribute every suspected case to him. Nevertheless, many believed the true number of victims would never be known. Families of the murdered boys experienced overwhelming emotions during this period. Some parents expressed relief that no additional children would likely suffer the same fate. Others felt renewed grief as every detail presented by investigators forced them to relive the worst moments of their lives. Many struggled with impossible questions. Could their children have survived if police had identified Dion sooner? Had warning signs existed that everyone somehow missed? Those questions carried no comforting answers. Detectives wrestled with similar thoughts. Many privately admitted frustration that Dion had remained beyond their reach for so long. They reviewed earlier interviews repeatedly, wondering whether different investigative techniques might have accelerated his capture. Yet they also recognized the limitations imposed by the era. Without modern forensic technology, without centralized criminal databases, and without sophisticated behavioral profiling, identifying serial offenders depended almost entirely upon patient investigative work. Ultimately, that persistence succeeded. The arrest of Leopold Dion marked a turning point not only for the investigation, but for criminal justice in Canada itself. Police agencies began recognizing patterns previously overlooked when children disappeared across different jurisdictions. Information sharing improved. Greater attention focused upon repeat sexual offenders. Cases that might once have remained isolated investigations increasingly became coordinated efforts. For the first time in years, communities slowly allowed themselves to hope. Children still walked cautiously to school. Parents continued watching them more closely than ever before. But beneath the lingering fear existed something absent for far too long. The belief that the man responsible for so much suffering would finally have to answer for his crimes before a court of law. The investigation that had consumed years of heartbreak was approaching its final chapter, and the evidence gathered against Leopold Dion would soon be tested where it mattered most. Inside a packed courtroom, before grieving families determined to hear justice pronounced at last. The courtroom became the final battleground in a case that had haunted Quebec for years. By the time Leopold Dion appeared before the judge, the man the newspapers had labeled the monster of Pont Rouge no longer looked like the mysterious predator who had terrified entire communities. He appeared small, quiet, and physically unimpressive. But no one inside the courthouse was fooled by appearances anymore. The families seated behind the prosecutors knew exactly what kind of man sat only a few meters away. Every parent who had buried a child, every investigator who had spent sleepless nights searching forests and abandoned buildings, every journalist who had documented the disappearances understood that the ordinary-looking defendant had destroyed countless lives. Security around the courthouse reflected the public's emotions. Uniformed officers stood at every entrance. Reporters crowded the sidewalks from sunrise, hoping to secure a position inside the courtroom. Families of victims arrived early, speaking very little to one another. Some carried photographs of sons who would never become teenagers. Others simply held each other's hands, uncertain whether finally confronting the accused would bring peace or reopen wounds that had never healed. When Leopold Dion entered the courtroom, every conversation stopped. For several seconds, the only sound came from chairs scraping quietly against the wooden floor as people adjusted themselves to watch him. Some parents stared directly at him without blinking. Others could not bear to look and kept their eyes fixed on the judge's bench instead. Detectives who had devoted years to tracking Dion studied him carefully, searching for signs of remorse. They found none. The prosecution presented the case methodically. Rather than relying upon emotion alone, prosecutors reconstructed Dion's crimes piece by piece. They demonstrated how each victim disappeared under remarkably similar circumstances. Young boys had been approached during ordinary afternoons while walking alone or playing without close adult supervision. Witnesses described a friendly stranger who used calm conversation, small gifts, or promises to gain trust before leading children away. The similarities became impossible to ignore once viewed together. Police investigators then described the years-long search that eventually narrowed their focus to Dion. Maps displayed inside the courtroom illustrated the locations where boys disappeared and where their bodies had later been discovered. Detectives explained how hundreds of potential suspects had been investigated before Dion emerged as the central figure. Jurors listened as investigators detailed the painstaking process of interviewing witnesses multiple times, comparing statements collected years apart, and identifying recurring behavioral patterns that pointed consistently toward the defendant. The testimony often became emotionally overwhelming. Parents listened while prosecutors described the final known moments of their children's lives. Teachers recalled the afternoons when empty classroom seats signaled that something had gone terribly wrong. Volunteers described endless searches through fields and forests where hope slowly transformed into despair. Some witnesses struggled to continue speaking, forcing the judge to pause proceedings while emotions settled. Perhaps the most devastating testimony came from surviving boys who had encountered Dion but escaped becoming victims. Now older, they recounted seemingly ordinary conversations that had only later revealed their true danger. One remembered being offered candy. Another recalled being promised money. A third described the uncomfortable feeling that convinced him to run home instead of following the stranger. None of them realized at the time how narrowly they had escaped. Their testimonies demonstrated not only Dion's methods, but also the frightening randomness separating survivors from victims. Psychological experts testified next. They explained the behavioral characteristics common among child predators who repeatedly target vulnerable victims. Such offenders often appear polite, cooperative, and harmless in everyday life. They cultivate trust deliberately. They rehearse conversations. They study routines until opportunities present themselves naturally. Prosecutors argued that Dion's conduct matched those characteristics with alarming accuracy. The defense attempted to challenge the investigation. Attorneys questioned the reliability of witness memories collected years after the crimes. They argued that public fear and extensive media coverage could have influenced recollections. They emphasized the absence of modern forensic evidence linking Dion directly to every suspected offense. Without DNA technology available decades later, many physical traces simply could not provide definitive answers. Yet the cumulative weight of evidence remained overwhelming. Investigators presented Dion's own admissions concerning repeated sexual assaults against boys. They highlighted his familiarity with areas where victims disappeared. Witness after witness placed him near children shortly before they vanished. Behavioral evidence, prior misconduct, opportunity, and consistent testimony combined into a picture that became increasingly difficult for the defense to dismantle. Throughout the proceedings, Dion displayed remarkably little emotion. Observers expected visible guilt, anger, or fear. Instead, he often appeared detached, almost indifferent to the devastating stories unfolding around him. Reporters noted that he rarely looked toward the victims' families. When particularly emotional testimony filled the courtroom, Dion frequently stared downward or toward the defense table without visible reaction. For grieving parents, that emotional emptiness proved almost as painful as the crimes themselves. Many later said they had hoped, however irrationally, to see some sign that the man responsible understood the suffering he had caused. Instead, they saw only silence. As the trial continued, prosecutors introduced evidence regarding additional suspected victims whose murders could not be formally charged because of insufficient proof. The judge carefully instructed jurors regarding what evidence they could legally consider. Even so, everyone inside the courtroom recognized that the 4 murders before the court likely represented only part of Dion's violent history. Detectives quietly acknowledged that numerous unanswered questions would probably remain forever unresolved. Closing arguments lasted hours. The prosecution reminded jurors that serial offenders rarely leave behind perfect evidence, particularly during an era before modern forensic science. Justice required evaluating the totality of circumstances rather than searching for one dramatic piece of proof. Every witness, every investigative finding, every admission, and every behavioral pattern pointed toward one conclusion. Leopold Dion had hunted children deliberately and repeatedly. The defense urged caution. They warned jurors against allowing horror to replace certainty. They argued that public outrage could not substitute for incontrovertible evidence. The burden remained on the prosecution to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Then came the waiting. Families endured agonizing hours while jurors deliberated. Some prayed quietly. Others paced courthouse corridors, unable to remain seated. Detectives who had worked the investigation for years found themselves feeling unexpectedly nervous. After so much effort, everything rested upon 12 ordinary citizens evaluating evidence gathered through countless painful years. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom became absolutely silent. No one shifted in their seats. No one whispered. The 4 persons stood and delivered the verdict. Guilty. On every count presented before the court, Leopold Dion was found guilty. The emotional release inside the courtroom proved immediate. Several parents embraced one another through tears. Detectives who rarely displayed emotion publicly admitted later that relief washed over them with unexpected force. Years of unanswered questions, exhausting investigations, and impossible conversations with grieving families had finally produced accountability. The judge then addressed Dion directly. He described the extraordinary cruelty inflicted upon innocent children and the immeasurable suffering imposed upon families and communities throughout Quebec. The crimes represented some of the most disturbing offenses imaginable. Society required permanent protection from an individual who had repeatedly demonstrated complete disregard for human life. Leopold Dion received a sentence of life imprisonment. At the time, many Canadians viewed the punishment as the only acceptable outcome. Few believed rehabilitation possible after crimes of such calculated brutality. Families expressed gratitude that he would never again have the opportunity to approach another child. Yet justice carried limits. No verdict could return stolen lives. No sentence could restore birthdays never celebrated, futures never lived, or parents forever haunted by memories of children who had disappeared during what should have been ordinary afternoons. Even as reporters declared that the monster of Pont Rouge had finally been defeated, many families recognized that their own trials would continue long after the courthouse emptied. For investigators, however, one chapter had finally closed. The man who had hidden behind an ordinary face while preying upon society's most vulnerable children had been exposed before the entire nation. His conviction represented more than punishment. It demonstrated that persistence, patience, and determined investigative work could eventually uncover even those predators who believed themselves invisible. No one inside that courtroom imagined that Leopold Dion's time in prison would prove surprisingly short. Not because of freedom, but because fate itself was already moving toward its own final judgment. The story of Leopold Dion did not end with the closing of the courtroom doors or the judge's final sentence. For the families who had lost sons, justice and healing were never the same thing. A conviction could provide certainty. It could remove a dangerous man from society. It could acknowledge publicly that unimaginable crimes had truly happened. But it could never restore the empty bedrooms that remained untouched for years, the birthday cakes that would never again be baked, or the futures stolen from children who had barely begun discovering the world. In the weeks following the trial, Quebec experienced an unusual silence. For nearly 6 years, Newspapers had reported one missing child after another. Parents had read every headline with growing dread, wondering whether the next victim might belong to their own neighborhood. Children who once wandered freely between friends' houses had gradually disappeared from sidewalks as families kept them indoors. Entire communities had lived beneath an invisible weight, never knowing where the monster might appear next. Now that weight slowly began to lift. Schools reopened without the constant fear that another desk would suddenly remain empty forever. Parents still walked children to school more frequently than before, but the overwhelming panic gradually faded into cautious vigilance. Parks that had once echoed with anxiety slowly filled again with children's voices. Life returned, although it would never quite resemble the innocent world that had existed before Dion's crimes. For investigators, the conclusion of the case brought mixed emotions. Many officers admitted that solving the murders offered professional satisfaction, yet the victory felt incomplete. Throughout the investigation, they had become personally acquainted with grieving parents whose lives had been permanently transformed. Detectives remembered every late-night interview, every desperate search through forests, every telephone call informing families that another clue had led nowhere. Solving the case meant preventing future victims, but it could never erase the suffering already endured. Some investigators continued reviewing older missing person files for years afterward. They remained convinced that Leopold Dion's known victims represented only part of his true criminal history. Certain disappearances shared disturbing similarities with his established methods. Young boys had vanished under circumstances impossible to ignore. Unfortunately, the forensic limitations of the era prevented many questions from ever receiving definitive answers. Time had destroyed evidence. Witnesses had forgotten details. Potential crime scenes no longer existed in their original condition. History would therefore remember Dion as the man convicted of 4 murders, while many experts privately believed the actual number could have been significantly higher. That uncertainty became one of the case's most haunting legacies. The victims' families faced an entirely different challenge. After years devoted almost exclusively to police interviews, court proceedings, and media attention, they suddenly found themselves confronting ordinary life again. Friends expected them to move forward. Neighbors assumed the trial had provided closure. Yet grief rarely follows legal calendars. Some parents continued setting places at dinner tables long after their sons were gone. Others preserved bedrooms exactly as children had left them, unable to remove toys, books, or clothing that represented the final physical connection to the lives they had loved. Many families found comfort through one another. Support groups gradually formed among parents who understood a unique kind of heartbreak. They shared memories rather than legal arguments. They celebrated birthdays together. They visited grave sites side by side. While no one could replace what had been lost, they discovered that shared grief often became slightly easier to carry than loneliness. The broader public also began reflecting upon what the investigation had revealed. Before Leopold Dion, many Canadians believed serious crimes against children remained exceptionally rare within their communities. Parents often assumed danger came from strangers passing briefly through town rather than familiar faces living nearby. Dion shattered those assumptions forever. He demonstrated that predators frequently appeared completely ordinary. He held jobs. He lived among neighbors. He walked familiar streets. Nothing about his outward appearance announced the horrors concealed beneath the surface. That realization permanently changed how communities discussed child safety. Schools introduced stronger educational programs teaching children how to recognize inappropriate behavior, regardless of whether the adult appeared friendly. Parents increasingly emphasized that children should never accept gifts, rides, or invitations from unfamiliar adults, even those who seemed polite and trustworthy. Police departments strengthened communication between neighboring jurisdictions whenever children disappeared, recognizing that predators rarely respected municipal boundaries. The investigation itself also influenced Canadian law enforcement. Although behavioral profiling remained in its infancy during Dion's era, detectives increasingly appreciated the importance of identifying patterns connecting seemingly unrelated crimes. Cases once investigated separately began receiving coordinated attention. Information sharing improved. Officers developed greater awareness regarding repeat sexual offenders whose behavior might escalate toward homicide if left unchecked. Those changes would save lives in future decades. Leopold Dion himself would never experience old age. Only months after entering prison, doctors diagnosed him with an aggressive brain tumor. Despite medical treatment, his condition deteriorated rapidly. In 1963, still only 30 years old, the man who had terrorized Quebec died inside prison. His death generated surprisingly little public sympathy. Most newspaper coverage focused not upon the prisoner who had died, but upon the children whose lives he had stolen. Families of victims expressed little interest in the details of his illness. For them, Dion's suffering could never compare with the permanent absence forced upon innocent boys who never reached adulthood. His grave attracted almost no public remembrance. Instead, history chose to remember the victims. Their names gradually became symbols of innocence interrupted by unimaginable cruelty. Communities honored them through memorials, newspaper retrospectives, and educational efforts reminding future generations that vigilance protects children only when society refuses to ignore warning signs. Decades later, criminologists continued studying Dion's case. They examined his childhood, psychological development, behavioral escalation, and victim selection in an effort to better understand how serial child predators emerge. Researchers found no simple explanation capable of transforming ordinary people into monsters. Instead, they identified complicated interactions among psychological disorders, deviant sexual interests, emotional instability, and opportunities left unchecked by society. Perhaps the most important lesson, however, had little to do with Leopold Dion himself. It concerned the victims. Every true crime story risks centering the offender until the people who suffered disappear into statistics. But behind every investigation stood children with favorite games, favorite foods, favorite stories before bedtime, dreams of becoming adults, and families who loved them beyond measure. Their lives deserved to be remembered for far more than the way they ended. The monster of Pont Rouge sought complete control over those children's stories. He failed. Today, his name survives primarily as a warning, while the memory of the boys he murdered continues reminding Canadians why child protection demands constant attention, patient investigation, and communities willing to believe that even the smallest warning sign deserves to be taken seriously. The legacy of Leopold Dion is not one of fear alone. It is also the legacy of parents who refuse to stop searching, investigators who refuse to abandon impossible cases, communities that learned painful lessons, and a justice system that ultimately held a predator accountable despite enormous obstacles. Their determination reshaped how Canada investigates crimes against children, proving that even when evil hides behind an ordinary smile, persistence, courage, and compassion can eventually expose the truth. And perhaps that remains the final lesson of this case. Monsters rarely announce themselves. They blend into everyday life, wearing familiar faces and ordinary routines. Protecting the innocent, therefore, depends not upon living in constant fear, but upon remaining observant, listening to children, trusting instincts when something feels wrong, and never allowing silence to protect those who prey upon society's most vulnerable. Every child deserves the chance to grow up believing the world is safe. Every community carries the responsibility to make that belief as true as possible. The case did not disappear when Leopold Dion died behind prison walls. In many ways, the real consequences only became visible during the decades that followed. Every major investigation into child disappearances in Quebec would eventually be compared to the failures and successes of the Dion investigation. Detectives who entered police academies years later still studied the files, not because they admired the investigation, but because they wanted to understand where precious hours had been lost and where opportunities had been missed. Those lessons would slowly reshape the way Canadian law enforcement approached crimes involving children. In the years before Dion's arrest, police departments often treated disappearances as isolated events. One missing child belonged to one local jurisdiction, another child to another town, and investigators rarely viewed the crimes together unless overwhelming evidence forced them to do so. Dion's pattern exposed the weakness of that approach. The boys came from different communities, disappeared on different dates, and had no direct connection to one another. Yet the offender remained the same. Modern investigators would later recognize that serial predators thrive when information remains fragmented. After the Dion investigation, communication between neighboring police agencies became increasingly important whenever children disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Parents also changed. For generations, many families throughout rural Quebec believed that danger came from distant cities or unknown outsiders. Their neighborhoods were small, familiar, and built upon trust. Children walked to school alone. They rode bicycles until sunset. They played in parks without constant supervision because everyone believed they knew one another. Dion shattered that illusion forever. He was not a mysterious figure hiding in the shadows every day. He blended into ordinary life. He looked approachable. He spoke calmly. He knew how to make frightened children feel comfortable within minutes. That realization permanently altered how families discussed personal safety. Schools gradually introduced educational programs teaching children to recognize inappropriate behavior. Teachers explained that strangers were not always frightening-looking people hiding in dark alleyways. Sometimes they smiled. Sometimes they offered gifts. Sometimes they sounded friendly. Children learned that no candy, no money, and no promise of adventure was worth leaving with someone they did not truly know. Those conversations, uncomfortable as they often were, became one of Dion's unintended legacies. Criminologists continued examining his life for decades. They searched for a single event capable of explaining how an ordinary young man transformed into one of Canada's most notorious child killers. Instead, they found layers of psychological complexity without simple answers. Dion demonstrated many characteristics now associated with organized sexual predators. He planned carefully. He selected vulnerable victims. He understood how to manipulate trust before resorting to violence. Experts concluded that offenders like Dion rarely emerge overnight. Their behavior often escalates gradually while remaining invisible to those around them until irreversible tragedy occurs. Even today, specialists continue debating one haunting question. How many victims did Leopold Dion truly claim? The courts established responsibility for 4 murders, yet investigators privately acknowledged lingering uncertainty. Several unsolved disappearances from the same era shared disturbing similarities with Dion's methods. Some children vanished without leaving meaningful evidence. Others disappeared before investigators fully understood the behavioral patterns connecting the crimes. Modern forensic science might have answered questions impossible to resolve during the early 1960s. Instead, those missing names remain suspended in history, leaving families with doubts that will probably never disappear. For surviving relatives of the confirmed victims, grief changed shape but never truly ended. The first years after the murders were dominated by shock. The following years became filled with anniversaries, birthdays, and milestones that never arrived. Parents imagined graduations that would never happen. Brothers and sisters grew older than the boys who had been taken away. Family photographs gradually became more painful because every passing year highlighted the lives that had been interrupted forever. Some families chose privacy. Others spoke publicly about their sons whenever journalists requested interviews. They wanted Canadians to remember that their children had names, personalities, dreams, and futures beyond becoming statistics inside a criminal investigation. They resisted allowing Leopold Dion to become the central character of the story. Instead, they insisted that every discussion begin with the innocent boys whose lives had been stolen. Their determination influenced later victim advocacy movements throughout Canada. As public awareness evolved, media organizations increasingly focused upon victims rather than offenders. Memorial ceremonies emphasized childhood, family, and resilience instead of sensationalizing violence. Police departments improved communication with grieving relatives during investigations, recognizing that compassion remained as important as procedure. The legal system also changed. Although no single law emerged solely because of Dion's crimes, growing awareness surrounding child protection encouraged legislators and police leaders to strengthen investigative procedures involving missing children. Cases once considered routine missing person reports increasingly received immediate attention whenever young children disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Time became recognized as the most valuable resource investigators possess during child abduction cases. Perhaps the greatest lesson concerns appearances. Leopold Dion did not resemble the monster imagined by frightened communities. He wore ordinary clothing. He moved through familiar streets unnoticed. Nothing about his appearance warned strangers that unimaginable violence existed beneath the surface. That uncomfortable truth continues challenging investigators today. Dangerous offenders rarely identify themselves through obvious signs. They often cultivate ordinary lives specifically because normality becomes their greatest disguise. Yet the story refuses to end with darkness alone. Communities learned. Parents adapted. Investigators improved. Teachers educated. Children received stronger protections than previous generations had known. The suffering endured by Dion's victims became the foundation for improvements that have protected countless children since. History remembers Leopold Dion as one of Canada's most infamous serial killers. But history should remember something else as well. It should remember investigators who refused to abandon impossible cases despite years without answers. It should remember parents who continued searching long after hope seemed impossible. It should remember communities that transformed fear into determination rather than surrender. Most importantly, it should remember the young boys whose lives mattered long before tragedy brought their names into newspaper headlines. Every true crime story ultimately asks the same question. How can ordinary people prevent extraordinary evil? The answer rarely lies in fear alone. It lies in awareness, communication, patience, and the willingness to act when something feels wrong. It lies in believing children when they express discomfort. It lies in neighbors watching out for one another. It lies in investigators refusing to dismiss small details that may later reveal enormous truths. That remains the lasting legacy of Leopold Dion. His crimes exposed unimaginable cruelty, but they also forced an entire nation to become more vigilant, more compassionate, and more determined to protect its youngest citizens. In the end, the monster of Pont Rouge lost the only battle that truly mattered. His victims are remembered with love. He is remembered only as a warning. The death of Leopold Dion inside a prison hospital closed the legal chapter of his crimes, but it did not close the emotional wounds he left behind. Long after the newspapers stopped printing his name across their front pages, the families of his victims continued waking every morning to the same silence that had settled over their homes decades earlier. Justice had been delivered in the eyes of the courts, yet justice could never restore birthdays that were never celebrated, childhood dreams that were never fulfilled, or empty chairs that remained untouched during every family gathering. Across Quebec, people remembered exactly where they had been when the news first spread that the so-called monster of Pont Rouge had finally been arrested. For many parents, the announcement brought relief powerful enough to make them cry. For months, some had barely allowed their children to leave the house alone. Parks that once echoed with laughter had become strangely quiet. Parents walked their children to school even when the distance was only a few blocks. Every unfamiliar face in the neighborhood became a reason for suspicion. The fear had reached far beyond the communities where Dion operated. His crimes exposed something deeply unsettling about human nature. Until then, many Canadians believed that predators were easy to recognize. They imagined dangerous men as rough-looking strangers lurking in dark alleyways. Dion destroyed that illusion. He appeared ordinary. He worked regular jobs. He smiled. He carried conversations without raising suspicion. That ordinary appearance became one of the most frightening aspects of the entire case because it forced society to acknowledge that evil rarely announces itself. Psychologists later studied Dion extensively, searching for warning signs that might have predicted his violent behavior years before the murders occurred. They discovered a man capable of separating his public image from his private compulsions with disturbing precision. He could behave politely while carrying fantasies that would eventually become reality. Modern criminal profilers often point to cases like Dion's when explaining why superficial impressions cannot replace careful behavioral analysis. His crimes also transformed police work. Before the Dion investigation, missing children were frequently investigated as isolated events. Local departments focused almost exclusively on their own jurisdiction. Information sharing between neighboring communities often depended upon personal relationships between investigators rather than organized systems. Dion exploited those weaknesses without anyone realizing it. Only after multiple disappearances did investigators begin recognizing recurring behavioral patterns. The victims were similar in age. They disappeared under comparable circumstances. Witnesses described encounters with an approachable adult male who never appeared threatening. Those observations eventually helped investigators understand that the crimes were connected rather than random. Today, those principles form the foundation of modern investigations involving missing children. Behavioral profiling, centralized databases, interagency cooperation, and rapid information sharing all grew stronger because earlier cases demonstrated how dangerous fragmented investigations could become. Every hour matters. Every witness matters. Every overlooked detail can become the difference between rescue and tragedy. The public changed as well. Schools introduced conversations about personal safety that previous generations had rarely discussed. Teachers encouraged children to trust their instincts, even when adults appeared friendly. Parents taught sons and daughters never to leave with strangers regardless of promises involving toys, money, candy, or exciting adventures. These conversations were uncomfortable, but they became necessary. Many experts argue that Dion's case permanently changed Canadian attitudes toward child protection. Instead of assuming communities were automatically safe because neighbors knew one another, families became more aware that predators often relied upon familiarity rather than anonymity. Children learned to recognize manipulation instead of simply fearing strangers. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy belongs not to Leopold Dion, but to the boys whose lives were stolen. Their names continued appearing during memorial services, historical documentaries, and educational programs designed to remind future generations why vigilance matters. Families refused to allow the victims to become forgotten footnotes beneath the shadow of their killer's notoriety. Parents remembered boys who loved bicycles, who dreamed about growing older, who laughed with friends after school, who trusted adults because childhood naturally expects kindness rather than cruelty. Those memories matter. True crime often risks focusing so intensely upon offenders that victims gradually disappear into statistics. But every number represents a child whose future vanished forever. Every investigation file represents parents forced to identify their son. Every conviction represents a family learning to continue living despite unimaginable grief. Leopold Dion died decades ago. His violence ended inside prison walls. But the lessons left behind continue protecting children every single day. Investigators still study the mistakes made during the early years of the case. Teachers still explain the importance of personal safety. Parents still hold their children's hands a little tighter after hearing stories like this. Perhaps that is the only meaningful victory that can emerge from such darkness. A society willing to learn. A community determined never to repeat the same mistakes. And generations of children growing up safer because innocent boys paid the highest possible price. History remembers Leopold Dion as one of Canada's most infamous child killers. History should remember his victims for something far greater. They became the reason an entire nation decided that protecting children could never again be treated as someone else's responsibility. Decades after the name Leopold Dion became associated with fear, one question continues to remain in the minds of investigators, historians, and families who lived through that terrifying period. Was the full truth ever discovered? The official records confirmed 4 murders. 4 young boys whose lives ended because they crossed paths with a man who understood how to manipulate trust. For families who received the kind of news no parent should ever hear. For tragedies that became forever connected to the name, the monster of Pont Rouge. But behind those confirmed cases remained a darker possibility. There may have been more. During the years between 1957 and 1963, Quebec experienced several disappearances involving young boys. Some cases were solved. Others remained surrounded by uncertainty. In an era before modern DNA testing, digital databases, and advanced criminal profiling, investigators often worked with limited tools. Evidence disappeared with time. Witness memories changed. Some families never received the answers they desperately wanted. The possibility that Dion had additional victims became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. For investigators who studied his crimes, the pattern was difficult to ignore. Dion did not appear to act impulsively. He developed a method. He searched for vulnerability. He identified children who were easier to approach. He used simple promises that sounded harmless to a young mind. A piece of candy, a small amount of money, a friendly conversation, a reason to follow him for just a few moments. That ability to create trust was what made him so dangerous. A child's natural innocence became the very thing Dion exploited. Children are taught that adults are protectors. They look for kindness in faces. They believe promises because they have not yet learned that some people can use kindness as a disguise. Dion understood this. He knew that fear was not always the most effective weapon. Sometimes a smile was enough. That realization changed the way society viewed child safety. Before cases like Dion's, many parents believed danger came from obvious threats. They warned children about strangers who looked frightening or acted aggressively. But predators often depend on the opposite image. They try to appear safe. They try to appear normal. They build confidence before they destroy it. The Dion case forced communities to rethink those assumptions. The unanswered questions surrounding his possible additional crimes also reveal the emotional burden carried by investigators. For many detectives, solving a murder is not only about identifying the offender. It is also about restoring a sense of order to a world that has been shattered. But some cases never provide complete closure. An investigator can find a suspect. A court can deliver a conviction. A prison sentence can be handed down. Yet there are moments when a file closes while questions remain open forever. Did Dion confess everything? Did he reveal the full number of victims? Did he take secrets to the grave? Because Dion died in prison from illness in 1963 at only 30 years old, many of those answers disappeared with him. Unlike some offenders who spend years giving interviews or writing memoirs, Dion never had the opportunity to explain his actions publicly. There was no final statement that helped families understand why their children were targeted. There was no complete confession that connected every disappearance. There was only the evidence left behind and the painful uncertainty that remained. For families of missing children from that era, uncertainty became its own form of suffering. A confirmed tragedy, as devastating as it is, at least provides an answer. Families can mourn. They can visit a grave. They can hold a photograph and remember a person they lost. But when a child disappears without explanation, grief becomes something different. It becomes endless. Parents wonder where their child was. They wonder what happened. They imagine countless possibilities, each one more painful than the last. Every unidentified piece of information becomes a reason to hope. Every passing year becomes another reminder that the answer may never come. This is why unresolved cases remain alive for generations. They are not simply police files stored away in archives. They are unfinished stories. They represent families who never received the final chapter. The legacy of Leopold Dion also raises another uncomfortable question. How could someone capable of such cruelty remain hidden for so long? The answer lies partly in the limitations of the time. The 1950s and early 1960s were very different from today. Communities were smaller, but communication between authorities was slower. There were fewer resources dedicated specifically to child abduction cases. The concept of serial offenders was not as developed as it is now. Today, when multiple children disappear under similar circumstances, investigators immediately search for connections. They compare timelines. They analyze behaviors. They examine patterns. In Dion's era, those connections were much harder to identify. Every missing child had to be understood separately before anyone could see the larger picture. By the time investigators recognized the possibility of a repeating pattern, valuable time had already passed. The case became a lesson written in tragedy. It demonstrated that predators do not always stop after one crime. It showed that early warning signs must be taken seriously. It proved that communities and law enforcement agencies must work together when children are at risk. The name Leopold Dion remains painful because it represents what happens when trust is betrayed in the most devastating way. But the story also represents change. The fear he created pushed society toward greater awareness. The suffering of the victims' families encouraged stronger protections. The failures of the past became lessons for future investigations. The unanswered questions may never completely disappear. There may always be names missing from the story. There may always be families wondering if their child was another victim. There may always be historians searching through old records, hoping to uncover one final piece of the puzzle. But one truth remains undeniable. The boys who lost their lives were more than victims of a criminal case. They were sons. They were brothers. They were friends. They were children with entire futures ahead of them. And while the world remembers Leopold Dion because of the darkness he created, the most important memory is not the monster. It is the lives he took. Because the true measure of history is not how long we remember those who caused suffering. It is how deeply we honor those who suffered. The story of Leopold Dion is not only a story about crimes committed in the shadows. It is also a story about manipulation, deception, and the terrifying ability of some individuals to hide their darkest impulses behind an ordinary appearance. For many people who studied the case, one of the most disturbing questions was not only what Dion did, but how he was able to do it. How could someone walk through a neighborhood, speak calmly to children, look into the eyes of families, and continue living as if nothing was wrong? The answer lies in understanding the psychology of predators. Criminal experts often explain that individuals who target children rarely begin by showing violence. They begin by creating access. They create familiarity. They search for moments when trust can be built. A child is naturally curious, naturally open, and naturally willing to believe that adults mean well. Dion understood that innocence. He did not need to force his way into a child's world immediately. He could enter slowly, through small conversations and simple promises. That was what made him dangerous. The threat was not obvious. It was hidden behind normal human interaction. A child predator often studies reactions. They learn what makes someone comfortable. They learn what words create confidence. They learn how to appear harmless. The most frightening part is that this behavior does not always look like evil from the outside. It can look like kindness. It can look like friendliness. It can look like someone who belongs. That was one of the reasons the case shocked Quebec so deeply. The community wanted to believe that danger had a recognizable face. They wanted to believe that someone capable of harming children would immediately appear different from everyone else. But Dion challenged that belief. He showed that some people can maintain a false image while hiding something deeply disturbing underneath. Behind closed doors, however, a different personality existed. The public image and the private reality did not match. This contrast is often seen in cases involving serial offenders. They may create a version of themselves that others accept while secretly developing behaviors, fantasies, and obsessions that remain invisible. They learn how to perform normality. They know what society expects from them. They know how to smile at the right moment. They know how to appear calm when others would expect guilt. This does not mean every person who seems unusual is dangerous. It means that appearances alone are never enough to understand someone's true intentions. In Dion's case, investigators eventually faced the challenge of looking beyond the surface. They had to stop asking only, who could do something like this? They had to ask a much harder question. Who had the ability to hide it? The psychology of manipulation also explains why children are especially vulnerable. Children are still learning how the world works. Their understanding of danger is different from an adult's. They often judge people based on simple signals: a friendly voice, a smile, a familiar environment. Predators exploit those instincts. They turn trust into a weakness. This is why modern child safety education focuses less on creating fear and more on teaching awareness. Children are taught that they can trust their feelings. They are taught that they can say no. They are taught that uncomfortable situations should be reported, even when the person involved is someone they know. Those lessons came from painful experiences. Cases like Dion's forced society to understand that protecting children requires more than warnings about strangers. It requires understanding human behavior. Another disturbing element of Dion's story was the possibility that he had been able to continue because people underestimated what was happening. In many historical cases, warning signs existed before the crimes were fully understood. But those signs were often viewed separately. A strange interaction, a suspicious behavior, a disappearance that seemed unrelated. Only later do investigators see the pattern. This is one of the greatest challenges in criminal investigation. The truth is often hidden in ordinary moments. A conversation that seemed meaningless. A detail that appeared unimportant. A memory that someone almost forgot. Years later, those small pieces can become the foundation of an investigation. The Dion case became a reminder that predators often depend on silence. They depend on people dismissing their instincts. They depend on communities believing that terrible things cannot happen near them. But evil does not require a dramatic entrance. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it looks familiar. Sometimes it hides among everyday life. That is what makes these cases so unsettling. The monster of Pont Rouge was not remembered only because of the violence he committed. He was remembered because he represented a fear that every parent understands. The fear that someone could take advantage of a child's innocence. For the families affected, the psychological impact lasted far beyond the courtroom. A murder investigation eventually ends. A trial eventually ends. A sentence is eventually announced. But trauma does not follow a schedule. The families had to continue living with memories that could not be erased. Places that once felt ordinary could become reminders. Dates could bring back painful emotions. Childhood memories could become connected to loss. The victims' families were forced to carry a burden they never asked for. And this is why true crime stories must always return to the people harmed, not only the person responsible. Understanding the psychology of an offender should never become an excuse. It should never reduce responsibility. Instead, it should help society recognize danger earlier and prevent future tragedies. Leopold Dion's crimes remain a dark chapter in Canadian history, but studying that darkness serves a purpose. It teaches that trust must be protected. It teaches that children deserve safety. It teaches that communities must pay attention when something feels wrong. Because behind every investigation is a human story. Behind every statistic is a child. And behind every tragedy is a reminder that awareness can save lives. When the name Leopold Dion became known across Quebec, it did not only represent the discovery of a murderer. It represented a painful moment when an entire society was forced to look at the way it protected its most vulnerable members. The investigation into the monster of Pont Rouge unfolded during a time when policing was very different from what it is today. There were no advanced digital systems connecting every department instantly. There were no massive national databases capable of comparing cases in seconds. Investigators relied heavily on interviews, physical evidence, local knowledge, and the ability to recognize patterns through experience. But when children began disappearing, time became the enemy. Every missing child created a wave of panic. Parents searched streets, neighbors looked through parks and empty fields, and police officers followed every possible lead. Behind every report was the same desperate hope, that the child would be found alive. But as the disappearances continued, fear grew into something larger. People began asking whether they were dealing with separate tragedies or one person moving through different communities. That question changed everything. At first, missing children cases were often treated individually. A child could have wandered away. A child could have run away from home. A child could have been lost somewhere nearby. Those possibilities had to be considered. But investigators slowly began noticing similarities. The victims were young boys. The circumstances surrounding their disappearances shared disturbing patterns. There were signs that someone may have been gaining their trust before attacking. The realization that one offender could be responsible for multiple crimes was terrifying, but it also gave investigators a new direction. Instead of searching for unrelated explanations, they began searching for a common thread. And that thread led them toward Leopold Dion. The investigation required patience because Dion did not fit the image many people had of a violent criminal. He was not someone who openly displayed aggression in public. He was not someone who announced his intentions. Like many predators, his greatest weapon was the ability to appear ordinary. This created a difficult challenge for investigators. They were not simply searching for a dangerous man. They were searching for a man who had learned how to hide danger. Every interview became important. Every witness memory became valuable. Every small detail had the potential to reveal something larger. In cases involving children, investigators often face a unique emotional challenge. They must remain focused and professional while dealing with the reality that the victims are young and vulnerable. The disappearance of a child affects an entire community because children represent innocence and possibility. A missing child is not only a police matter. It becomes a collective fear. Families begin looking differently at their surroundings. Parents become more cautious. Children who once played freely outside are suddenly watched more closely. Everyday routines change because people no longer feel completely safe. That atmosphere existed during the years Dion terrorized Quebec. Communities that once trusted familiarity began questioning it. A neighbor could no longer be judged only by reputation. A friendly stranger could no longer automatically be considered harmless. The investigation also highlighted the importance of cooperation between law enforcement agencies. When crimes cross different areas, information sharing becomes essential. A clue discovered in one location may solve a mystery somewhere else. The Dion case became one of the examples that showed why investigators needed stronger methods for connecting crimes and identifying repeat offenders. The world of criminal investigation was learning an important lesson. A predator's pattern can be more revealing than a single crime. The way an offender approaches victims. The way they choose locations. The way they manipulate trust. These details create a behavioral signature. Today, criminal profilers and investigators use many of these principles routinely. But during Dion's era, these ideas were still developing. The tragedy was that those lessons came through suffering. After Dion's arrest, investigators continued examining the known cases and reviewing information connected to his crimes. The possibility that additional victims existed remained one of the most haunting questions surrounding the investigation. For some families, the arrest brought relief. For others, it reopened wounds. Because when a killer is identified, families often face a complicated mixture of emotions. There can be anger. There can be sadness. There can even be a strange sense of peace because uncertainty has finally ended. But knowing the truth does not erase the pain. A courtroom cannot bring a child back. A conviction cannot restore lost years. A prison sentence cannot repair a broken family. Justice answers one question: who is responsible? But grief asks another question: why did this happen? And sometimes that question has no answer. The investigation into Leopold Dion became more than a search for one criminal. It became a turning point in how society viewed child safety. It showed that communities needed to pay attention to warning signs. It showed that missing children cases required immediate action. It showed that cooperation and prevention were essential. Most importantly, it changed the way people understood vulnerability. Children are trusting because they are children. They believe adults because they are supposed to believe adults. The responsibility belongs to society to protect that trust, not exploit it. The monster of Pont Rouge left behind a legacy of fear, but his crimes also created a legacy of awareness. The failures and challenges of that investigation helped shape better systems for the future. Today, when authorities respond quickly to missing children reports, when communities share information, and when parents teach safety skills, those actions carry the lessons learned from cases like Dion's. The investigation ended decades ago. The files were eventually closed. But the responsibility created by those events continues. Because every generation inherits the duty to protect children better than the one before. And that may be the most important chapter in the story of Leopold Dion. The name Leopold Dion remains one of the darkest names in Canadian criminal history. Even decades after his crimes ended, the memory of the monster of Pont Rouge continues to create a feeling of unease. His story is not remembered because of the number of years he was active, or because of the length of his criminal career. It is remembered because of the lives he destroyed and the fear he brought into communities that once believed their children were safe. The years between 1957 and 1963 changed many families forever. Before Dion's crimes became known, childhood in many communities looked very different. Children often spent long hours outside. They walked to school, played in neighborhoods, visited friends, and explored without constant supervision. Communities were built around familiarity. People knew their neighbors. Parents trusted that children could move through the world with a certain level of freedom. But when children began disappearing, that sense of security began to disappear as well. Parents who once watched their children run through the streets without worry began looking over their shoulders. Simple moments became filled with fear. A child leaving the house to play was no longer just a normal part of growing up. It became a moment that carried anxiety. The fear created by Dion was not limited to one family. It spread. It reached homes where parents wondered if their child could be next. It reached schools where teachers became more alert. It reached entire communities where people realized that danger could exist closer than they ever imagined. That is one of the most powerful impacts of crimes involving children. They do not only affect the victims and their families. They change the way society thinks. The case of Leopold Dion forced people to confront an uncomfortable reality. Evil does not always announce itself. A dangerous person may not look dangerous. A criminal may not appear frightening. Sometimes the most disturbing individuals are the ones who know how to blend into ordinary life. Dion's ability to manipulate trust became one of the most chilling aspects of the case. He understood how to approach children. He understood how to appear less threatening. He used things that seemed small and harmless because he knew that children respond to kindness and attention. That method revealed something important about predators. They often do not begin with violence. They begin with opportunity. They look for moments when they can create connection. They search for situations where they can gain access. They exploit innocence because innocence is built on trust. The legacy of Dion's crimes helped change the conversations around child protection. Families began teaching children different lessons. They learned that safety was not only about avoiding obvious danger. It was about recognizing uncomfortable situations. It was about encouraging children to speak openly. It was about understanding that children should never feel responsible for protecting adults' feelings when something feels wrong. These changes were not created from comfort. They came from tragedy. The victims of Leopold Dion became part of a painful history that influenced future generations. Their stories became reminders of why awareness matters. Their names represented the importance of protecting children who cannot protect themselves. For investigators, the case also became a lesson. Serial offenders are often discovered through patterns. A single disappearance may appear impossible to understand. A single crime may seem random. But when investigators connect information across time and locations, a hidden picture can begin to appear. The Dion investigation showed the importance of looking beyond individual incidents. It showed that every missing child deserves immediate attention. It showed that every clue matters. It showed that communities cannot assume terrible things only happen somewhere else. The aftermath of Dion's crimes also reveals the complicated nature of justice. When a criminal is caught, people often believe the story has reached its ending. The offender is identified. The court makes a decision. The sentence is delivered. But for families, the story does not end there. The courtroom cannot erase memories. It cannot remove the pain of an empty bedroom. It cannot replace birthdays, conversations, and future moments that were never experienced. Justice may provide accountability, but healing is a much longer journey. For some families connected to Dion's victims, the passage of time did not mean forgetting. It meant learning how to carry the loss. They carried memories of children who were more than victims in a criminal investigation. They were sons. They were brothers. They were children who laughed, played, dreamed, and had futures that should have continued. That is the part of the story that must never be lost. When history remembers criminals, there is always a risk that the person responsible becomes the center of attention. Their actions become analyzed. Their psychology becomes studied. Their name becomes repeated. But behind every crime is a person whose life was taken. The true focus should always return to those who suffered. Leopold Dion died in prison in 1963, ending the life of the man responsible for some of Canada's most horrifying crimes. But his death did not end the impact of what happened. The questions remained. The grief remained. The lessons remained. His case became part of the reason society developed stronger awareness about missing children and child safety. Today, many protections that seem normal exist because earlier generations experienced unimaginable tragedies. Every safety conversation, every prevention program, and every effort to protect children carries echoes of those past cases. The monster of Pont Rouge is remembered as a symbol of darkness. But the greater story is not about the darkness he created. It is about the responsibility that followed. It is about communities learning to protect one another. It is about families finding strength after unimaginable loss. It is about remembering that behind every headline is a human life. The story of Leopold Dion remains painful because it reminds us of the vulnerability of children and the importance of trust. But it also reminds us that awareness can grow from tragedy, and that society can become stronger by learning from its darkest moments. History cannot change what happened. It cannot bring back those who were lost. But it can ensure that their stories are not forgotten. And perhaps that is the most important legacy left behind by the victims of the monster of Pont Rouge.